The Paleolithic Period. The Paleolithic period was the earliest and longest period of human development. This period is also referred to as the Old Stone Age. And during this period, development was very slow. Just to give you an idea, the Paleolithic period is considered to range from about 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. So that whole period of almost 2 million years is all considered the Paleolithic period, where humans were developing very, very slowly. Since the Paleolithic period, humans have developed much, much faster. During the Paleolithic period, humans formed small groups or bands to live with. They survived by gathering plants and by fishing, hunting, or scavenging wild animals. So your very first humans may not have had any tools to use, and it would have been hard to hunt with your bare hands, so they may have had to scavenge wild animals. If one animal killed another animal, they would go and pick up what was left that they could. Fishing, same thing. They would have to learn to catch these fish in their hands until they developed tools or things like nets that they could use to help them. So at the very beginning of the Paleolithic period, gathering plants and scavenging animals would have been the primary way that these humans survived. Then as they went further through the Paleolithic period and developed tools, they would be able to fish and hunt on their own and come up with better ways to do these things. Now the Paleolithic period is divided into sections, the lower, middle, and upper periods. The lower Paleolithic period ranges from about 2 million years ago to about 100,000 years ago. And its most notable distinction is the appearance of stone tools. So this is the first time stone tools have been used by humans. So remember I was saying if you didn't have any tools to use, if you didn't have anything to hunt with, it would be hard to kill animals. So you would be scavenging them or picking plants because that's what you were able to do safely. Now, in the middle Paleolithic period, which is around 100,000 to 40,000 years ago, humans lived in caves and had the use of fire. So they are developing a little bit more. They hunted rather than scavenged animals. So in the middle Paleolithic period, these people are going to have more developed tools. They're going to have things that they can hunt with. They're going to be able to live in these caves and realize, okay, we can stay in one spot for a while instead of having to travel around gathering things and scavenging dead animals. And they have the use of fire. So they're going to be able to have a lot more variety with what they can do and with what they can eat. Now they had more advanced tools, including crude needles to sew furs together. So that was another tool they'd come up with. And once they started sewing furs together for clothing, they could use it for other items, which would come later. They may have practiced some kind of religion. So there's evidence that shows that, but nothing very concrete, nothing specific to tell us exactly what they might have practiced or what they might have believed in. But there's evidence that shows they might have practiced some kind of religion, or certain groups may have. Next, we'll go on to the upper Paleolithic period, about 40,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. So this is nearing the end of the Paleolithic period. It's been a long development for the humans of this sort, and in the upper Paleolithic period, you're going to have Homo sapiens, where people are going to basically look like we look now as far as our body type goes, but they just aren't as developed. They haven't discovered as many things. So during this period, many diverse cultures flourished. Instead of it just being small bands all scattered everywhere and everyone was about at the same level, there are lots of different cultures that are on different levels, maybe specializing in different things. Some are really good hunters, some are really good at at napping the tools that they need. Some are really good at sewing or making things that are pretty. Some are really good at making beads and putting jewelry together. There's lots of different things that people could specialize in, and these diverse cultures developed. Humans built their first man-made structures. So instead of only living in caves or wandering around looking for open shelter, people started making their own structures. They could build crude wooden homes or tents. They did still live in caves because it was handy, and if you were in an area that was really nice and had water and had lots of food, then you might just stay in the cave rather than build something else. But they had learned and developed enough to build their own structures. People crafted jewelry. So where I was talking about maybe some of the cultures specializing in making beads or sewing things together or patterns on things very attractively. They made jewelry and they drew on the walls of caves. So before the Upper Paleolithic period, we didn't really have any kind of artwork. Now we've got jewelry and you've got drawing and painting on the walls of caves. The Solutreans entered Europe from the east and conquered more primitive cultures. So now you have hunters that are coming through and actively conquering other cultures because they want those resources. They want all the tools that are there, all the food that's there, all the resources that are there. They want to live in that area, so they're fighting for it. So the Solutreans entered Europe and conquered more primitive cultures that were there. They were a standout culture that was a little more developed. And then the Magdalenians replaced the Solutreans. They conquered the Solutreans in turn. They were more advanced than the Solutreans were. So the Magdalenians developed very precise tools, such as the atlatl. And the atlatl was a wooden device that they could hold and put a spear on, and then whenever they flung it, it went even farther than if you threw it from your hand because the wood extended further than your arm. So whenever you threw it, it was like you had a way longer arm you were throwing the spear with. So this atlatl was a very precise and advanced tool for throwing spears. And they were famous for having that, but they were best known for their cave paintings in modern-day France. So the Magdalenians replaced the Solutreans, and they were the most developed culture of the Upper Paleolithic period, which was noted by their very advanced tools and their cave paintings that are still noted today. The Paleolithic period was the earliest and longest period of human development. It's where we first noted humans using stone tools all the way up through where they were building their own homes. They were creating cave paintings, jewelry. They had religion of some sort. They created more advanced tools for hunting, and they were forming their own cultures and not just in small little bands. So this was a period of about 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago, and it went from our very basic humans to our more advanced humans that look a lot like we look today. They just hadn't learned as much as we know now. The Egyptians. The Egyptians lived in a concentrated area along the lower parts of the Nile River around 3000 BC. And they were able to predict flooding and control irrigation, which made the Nile River Valley a very fertile area. And since they grew surplus crops, the Egyptians had time to pursue other interests. So the Egyptians lived in the Nile River Valley, the lower part of the land along the lower part of the Nile River, and they could predict when floods would occur, and they also had control of irrigation techniques. So they were able to farm a lot of that land and grow enough crops that they had plenty to spare. They had some to store up for the future, for times of drought or famine, and they had time to do other things. So they were definitely a farming community, but they had lots of other interests because their civilization developed in a very fertile area that made for an easier life than some of the other civilizations that were developing around the same time period. So the Egyptians developed writing. They had that extra time. They developed a system of writing. They farmed minerals from the valley and surrounding desert. So they figured out what minerals they could use from the ground, and they would go and farm them as well, or mine them out, because they had all this extra time. So they farmed the land, but they also farmed the minerals. They developed a vast trading network. So they have all this extra food, they've got these minerals, they can write, they can make jewelry, pottery. They had a lot of art, and their art and architecture were modeled throughout other civilizations in the surrounding areas as the Egyptians developed more and more. So they had a vast trading network. They would trade very far away from where they lived, and people would come from far away to trade with them. They developed a military to defend against attacks. So you can imagine living in this fertile valley. Other civilizations are going to say, hey, that spot looks really great. I want to live there. I want our people to live there. So the Egyptians did have to defend Egypt against attacks because this Nile River Valley was a pretty popular place, and people saw that it was good land and they tried to make it their own. So Egypt had to develop a military. They formulated an effective system of medicine. So they were able to record symptoms and say, oh, this looks similar to when this other person was sick. This is what we gave them and it made it better. This person doesn't look like they're getting better. They may have this much time to live. This person has a wound. If we put this medicine and wrap it up, it will get better. So they had an effective system of medicine. They organized collective construction. In fact, one of the Egyptians' greatest achievements were their pyramids. And the pyramids were not something that just a few people could build. These took lots and lots of time and lots of manpower to build. So the pyramids are something that a lot of people associate with Egypt even today. And back then, remember I said that a lot of other people modeled the Egyptians' art and architecture. One of their architectural things that people wanted to copy were the pyramids. They were very impressive. Even now they're very impressive, but for them to be able to make it back then without all of the modern equipment that we have was very impressive. So pyramids were originally built as burial sites for pharaohs who were the leaders in Egypt, and they were believed to continue ruling in the afterlife. So they made these huge pyramids, and they buried the pharaohs in there after they died, and they buried them with food and with servants and with animals, with gold, jewels. They wanted them to be entertained and fed and have plenty to drink and have plenty of people to wait on them in the afterlife as well. And so they buried all of this with them, thinking it would all go with the pharaoh to the next life. Peasants worked on the pyramids in exchange for food and shelter. So for people who maybe didn't have their own area of land, people who wanted these pyramids built would say, okay, you come build on the pyramid, we'll feed you and make sure you've got a place to live. The shape of the pyramids is meant to symbolize the slanting rays of the sun, and if you think about the way that the pyramids slant down, and the sloping sides were also thought to help the souls of the pharaohs climb to the sky to join the other gods. So slanting rays down from the sun, but also it slants up toward the sun from the ground, and so the pharaoh's soul was supposed to be assisted by those sloping sides. It could make its way up toward the sky to join the other gods. And just to give you an example of how much time and how much labor a pyramid might take, the largest pyramid from this time took around 20 years and around 100,000 laborers to complete. So if a pharaoh came into power, he better start getting his pyramid built really quickly, because by the time that it was done, it would be about the time he was going to be needing it. So the Egyptians were a very accomplished people. They were very ahead of their time, both in architecture and art, and they lived in the fertile Nile River Valley around 3000 BC. Early Mesopotamia, the Sumerians. Mesopotamia is the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, located in what is known today as the Middle East. And in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were a prominent civilization. So in early Mesopotamia, as this area was first being populated, the Sumerians were one of the prominent civilizations that populated this area. And they were there from around 4000 BC to around 1500 BC. Now they developed cuneiform. This is probably one of their most important achievements, because cuneiform is a system of writing that first used pictures or hieroglyphs and later used symbols. And it is the oldest example of writing on Earth, which means that as far as we found, they were the first civilization to write things down. And Sumerians wrote lots of things out. They wrote their laws, religious beliefs, hymns, prayers, daily records, business letters, receipts, and lexical lists, which were basically lists of the nouns and the different words that they used and different semantic forms of it. So not only did they leave lots of their own writing around, they left a record of their language. So you could go through the list of the words they used or the symbols that they used so that you could see what all the options were that could end up in any of the things that they wrote. And they wrote on clay tablets. They would get it a little wet and use a reed that had been dampened in water, and they could write on the clay while it was still wet, and then the clay would harden and these clay tablets would be preserved. And lots of these clay tablets from the Sumerians have been found and kept. Now the Sumerians also wrote out their complex mathematical systems in cuneiform. They were very mathematically advanced. They had theories about algebra, geometry. They wrote out multiplication charts. So they had a lot of mathematical knowledge going on there, and they kept records of it on these clay tablets. So it is preserved for us to still see today where the Sumerians were at, both in writing and mathematically. Now the Sumerians lived in mud brick buildings and farming communities. And they would live in these mud brick buildings for a while, and then slowly the mud brick would start to crumble, and they would have to tear them down and rebuild. And they did this over and over again as it became necessary, and so the areas that they lived on actually became raised up a little more than the land that was surrounding their buildings or their communities. And then the area around where they actually lived, they farmed. They used irrigation techniques and also kept some plants in pots or vases. They also would grow some trees that bore fruit and some other crops right next to their house, sort of like a yard. So they would grow things there that would be handy. Now they also primarily used oxen to plow and donkeys to transport goods. So they did practice large-scale farming where they actually went out and plowed the field and planted more than they actually needed. And that was what they used for food and for trading as well. But they had those plots right near their home, kind of like a yard, or the plants they grew in pots or vases, so that they would have something handy if they needed it. The Sumerians had use of the wheel. It first developed as the potter's wheel. They had a lot of pottery, and so the potter would spin the wheel and be able to better form pottery. Well, quickly they realized that they could use this wheel for vehicles, which would be pulled by the oxen and donkeys, and then a mill wheel, so they could grind all this grain that they're growing. Sumerians traded widely using the barter system. So they were very well known as traders, and they traded quite a ways away from where they actually lived. And they used the barter system. They didn't have currency. They didn't have any kind of coin that they used. They would trade goods with other cultures or services, perhaps. If they wanted someone to come and help them harvest a field, they may offer them some of the harvest. But they used the barter system. They didn't have any kind of money or currency to use to buy things they needed or wanted. They had pottery, carved wooden items, including furniture, and musical instruments, such as the lyre. There were carved wooden stools and chairs and bedposts that looked like the hooves of oxen, and they had a lot of other carvings like that, so they were kind of artistic, and they could use these things to trade with other cultures. They also had tools such as knives, drills, wedges, and a saw-like tool that were used daily in their farming community. But spears, bows, arrows, and daggers were used in times of war. They didn't have swords yet, but the rest of those weapons were also used during times of war, and they were things that the Sumerians had developed. Now, the Sumerians had an advanced military due to constant warring among city-states. So the Sumerians were a bigger civilization, and there were lots of little city-states within the Sumerian civilization, and they would go to war against each other from time to time. And it was actually pretty frequent that they would go to war with each other. And so their military strategy and their planning and their weapons were all a little more advanced than other cultures because they fought amongst each other so often. So these are a lot of different pieces of information to give you an idea of who the Sumerians were. They had a system of writing, the oldest system of writing, known as cuneiform. They recorded lots of their daily business as well as their laws and their mathematical systems. They were a farming community that did have use of the wheel, and they traded very widely using the barter system, as well as advancing their military strategy because they warred with each other. They fought with each other fairly constantly. So these were the Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations in the early Mesopotamian area. Early Mesopotamia, the Babylonians. Mesopotamia refers to the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now considered the Middle East, and lots of early civilizations developed in Mesopotamia. One of those was the Babylonians. The Babylonians became the dominant civilization in Mesopotamia after they conquered the Sumerians and established their capital city of Babylon on the Euphrates River around 1750 BC. So Babylon was the capital. Babylonia was the nation state, or the whole cultural region that all were following the Babylonian rule. So even though you see Babylonians, Babylon is the city, the capital city, but Babylonia was the nation state. That was the whole area that included lots and lots of cities. Now Hammurabi, you may have heard of, was Babylonia's most famous ruler. And the Babylonian Empire controlled all of Mesopotamia under his rule. He was able to help Babylonia and lead them to victory over lots of other cultures in that area, to where Babylonia was controlling all of Mesopotamia. There were no other cultures or nation states there. So they were in control of that whole area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. But the Babylonian Empire was very short-lived. It fell quickly after Hammurabi's death. So his predecessors, or the people who were going to come after him, were not as qualified to lead as he was, and they weren't able to hold everyone together the way Hammurabi was able to. So quickly, the cultures that had been conquered branched out and became their own cultures again. They didn't want to stay under Babylonia's rule, and once Hammurabi wasn't there to keep a tight grasp on them, this whole Babylonian empire fell apart. Now, Hammurabi is also famous for something else. He created the Hammurabi Code, which is a detailed set of 282 laws that were written out for all of Babylonians to follow. This was the first time that there was one set of laws to govern all of a culture in both their laws, their religion, and their society. And there were laws in this Hammurabi Code that referenced religion, slavery, military service, trade, codes of conduct, and duties of workers. One example you may have heard of was an eye for an eye. In the Hammurabi Code, it said if someone put someone's eye out, then the person who had put someone's eye out was required to lose an eye himself. It was eye for eye. Some of the laws were that quid pro quo, tit for tat, but some of them were a little more complex, and they did cover a lot of different topics. The Babylonians farmed using advanced irrigation techniques. So everyone who came before the Babylonians had been working toward farming and staying in one place. The Babylonians had become even more advanced at farming and staying in one place. They had these advanced irrigation techniques. They used drains, they used canals, they used dikes. They were able to better irrigate their fields, and they were more successful and able to keep more people surviving and grow their culture as a result of that. The Babylonians built their homes in massive temples out of mud brick. And this was due to their abundance of clay. They may not have had a whole lot in their region, but they had lots of clay, so they could make these mud bricks. And they did build huge temples, and lots of homes, and these cities got very big, especially Babylon. They also had pottery that was very pretty. They decorated with tiles. Some of them had zinc or gold plating them. Some of these homes and temples were very elaborate. They had libraries in most towns and temples. Men and women learned to write and to read. So it wasn't just a male-dominated society. Men and women learned to read and write. And libraries were found in almost every town and in the temples. So this was a very literate society. Sumerian was still used for laws and religion. You'll remember the Babylonians conquered the Sumerians. So Sumerian was still the language used for laws and religion, but Akkadian was the everyday language that people spoke. They wrote about mathematics and astronomy, including a record of the variation in the length of daylight over a solar year. So in winter when the days are shorter, in summer when the days are longer. This culture, the Babylonians, were the first to write about that and note that. They also noted other solar instances as well as recording more about their mathematics. So they were advanced in mathematics and astronomy as well. They wrote about the practice of medicine. They had diagnosis, prognosis, physical examinations, prescriptions. So they would look at someone, examine them, pay attention to their symptoms, and try to diagnose them based on previous experience and previous examinations and notes that they'd taken. And then they would say if they thought this person was likely to survive, how long they were going to survive, what kind of prescriptions they could offer. And they would use bandages, creams, pills. And if there was nothing else they could do, they would try exorcisms and try to exorcise a curse out of someone if they thought that there must be a curse in them, there was nothing that they could physically see that they would be able to help with their other prescriptions. The Babylonians became known for their ziggurats, which were long pyramid-like buildings that were used as religious temples. So these were another one of these massive temples that they built. These ziggurats were a specific kind that looked kind of like pyramids. And Babylon was eventually seen as a place of excess. So remember, Babylon is their capital, but when you hear Babylon, you kind of think of the whole Babylonian culture because the names are very similar. But Babylon was eventually seen as a place of excess, luxury, and arrogant power, which is kind of a negative connotation. And it is often used as a symbol for such things in literature as well as today. So in literature, if people were referring to a city as a modern-day Babylon, they were talking about a place that had excess, luxury, arrogant power. It was a negative place, or it wasn't something they were trying to give a positive connotation to, as something they were giving a negative connotation to. So these were the Babylonians, the dominant civilization after they conquered the Sumerians that lived in early Mesopotamia. Early Mesopotamia, the Jews. Mesopotamia refers to the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, located in what is known today as the Middle East. The early Mesopotamian region was home to a lot of early civilizations, and one of those is the Jewish civilization. The Jews have a long history that began in Mesopotamia. Abraham was basically the father of the Jewish civilization, and he was born in the Sumerian city-state of Ur around 2000 BC. Remember, Sumerians were the earliest culture that were found in Mesopotamia. So Abraham left from the city-state of Ur, and he traveled. He came to believe that there was one true God. Where the Sumerians in general had believed in many gods, Abraham came to believe that there is one true God. And God spoke to Abraham and told him to leave his home and travel to a new land that would become known as Canaan, where he would be father to a new great nation. So Abraham did that. He traveled. There was the new land known as Canaan. His descendants multiplied. And eventually, Abraham's descendants were enslaved by Egypt and then liberated by Moses, who was another Hebrew or Jewish leader, and eventually they reconquered Canaan. Moses was given the 10 Commandments, so he was another important Jewish leader. And he was given the 10 Commandments by God, which were 10 strict laws that all Jews followed. Around 1020 BC, the Hebrew leader Saul became the first king of Israel. So they returned to Canaan, and then eventually part of that area became known as Israel. And the Hebrew leader Saul became the first king in Israel. And King David came after Saul and conquered Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was an important city in that area, and he conquered Jerusalem and made it part of Israel. Then came King Solomon. And Solomon came next and built the first Jewish temple in Jerusalem around 960 BC. So they first had their king in Israel around 1020 BC, and then they conquered Jerusalem and made it part of Israel, and then they built their first Jewish temple in Jerusalem around 960 BC. And this temple was very sacred to them because it housed the Ark of the Covenant, which held the 2 tablets containing the 10 Commandments given to Moses, as well as other religious artifacts. So their most important religious items, as well as the laws that governed their whole culture, were housed in this temple that was built in Jerusalem. Israel was taken over around 740 BC by the Assyrians, and then later taken over by the Babylonians. Eventually, in 538 BC, around 200 years later, the Persian king Cyrus let the Jews return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. So remember, this temple housed all of their important religious and law-making artifacts. It was a very sacred building to them. So they were allowed around 200 years after being taken over and kicked out of the city to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. But Israel was later taken over by the Greeks under Alexander and then by the Romans under Pompey Magnus. So Israel and Jerusalem in general have been hotly contested, and they have been important areas, especially the city of Jerusalem, that lots of different nations have competed to claim ownership to. But around 960 BC, Jerusalem was in the hands of the Jews, and they built their temple there, which makes it a very important area for them. And the Jews were one of the most important cultures that began in Mesopotamia. They came from one of the Sumerian cultures and branched off to form their own Jewish culture around 2000 BC. American civilizations, early cultures. Mesoamerica, which is present-day Central and South America, was home to many developed civilizations 3,000 years before the arrival of Columbus. So Christopher Columbus sailed from Europe to the Americas in 1492, and he discovered America for Europe. But there were lots of civilizations developed there over 3,000 years before he got there. So whenever he did get to America, he found people there. There were civilizations that lived there before Europeans got there. Now, these early civilizations were very dependent on water-supported agriculture. And this is similar to cultures throughout the world. Most of them developed in a place where there was water that could support agriculture. That way they could settle down in one spot and they wouldn't have to have the hunter-gatherer lifestyle anymore. They'd be able to stay in one place and slowly build up that community. They grew maize, which is corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, and peppers. Now, they grew other things too, but these are some of the items that the early cultures of Mesoamerica are known for having domesticated. They learned how to grow them well and keep them growing in one place, and they grew them annually so that they would have these foods as a staple for their diet, and they could slowly build up surpluses and keep them for if there was a year where they didn't grow very much. They lacked large animals for domestication, such as horses, donkeys, oxen. So where in other areas of the world, people were able to domesticate these large animals and use them to help with agricultural work, the people in Mesoamerica were not able to do so. So the work in the field that they did was mainly done by human hands instead of by humans directing large animals to do the work. However, these early cultures were able to domesticate some animals for food purposes, such as turkeys, dogs, ducks, and deer. And they may have domesticated something else as well, but these are the ones that scientists have found hard evidence that they had domesticated, and so they found these present in large numbers around these early cultural sites. They also ate fruit, hunted, and fished if they lived near water. So while the early cultures in Mesoamerica were stabilized in one spot, they had their water-supported agriculture and they were living in one place, weren't doing the hunter-gatherer living anymore, they did still eat things that grew outside of what they domesticated. They did still hunt to add to their food supply, and they fished if they lived near water and had that opportunity. Most early cultures knew of the wheel and basic metallurgy. but neither became culturally important. So the wheel was most often used with these large animals so that the large animals could carry big loads around in a cart on wheels, or using different tools in the field that used wheels. And since these early cultures didn't have domesticated large animals, they didn't have as large of a need for the wheel. So they knew about it, they knew how it worked, they may have used it some, but it wasn't culturally important to them because they didn't have these large animals that would have made it so. And as far as metallurgy goes, they knew how to work metals, but while Europe was going through an Iron Age, the people in Mesoamerica weren't as culturally dependent or concerned with metalworking because they were using other things. Trade was important because most cultures lived in regions where they couldn't be entirely self-sufficient. And that's not to say they couldn't have fed themselves and lived a basic lifestyle, but as these cultures were able to settle down in one spot and grow up and have more and more of an urban center kind of develop, more people in one place meant that people were going to be able to specialize what they did, and they were going to want to make artistic things and learn more and write, and some of the things that they wanted weren't going to be found in their one region, so they would trade for them. They may have said, oh, I want this particular jewel from over there, so I'm going to trade for it. Or I want this particular stone type from over here, so I'm going to have to trade for that. And so where they would have had all the food, water, shelter that they needed for basic survival, they didn't have everything they wanted in one region. So the regions would have to trade with each other. So trade was very important between these early cultures. A calendar was developed to use with agriculture, which included 4 seasons, 2 solstices, and 2 equinoxes. Now, later cultures did add to this calendar and did make it much more detailed, more tailored to their particular culture, both religiously or culturally, with culturally significant events incorporated into it. But the first calendar was developed to use with agriculture. It showed them when the solstices and equinoxes being marked out on it, showed them when the seasons were changing. It told them when they could plant certain crops, when they should harvest certain crops, when they could expect food to come in. And so that's what was important to them. So while the calendar was definitely added to later on, the first calendar that these early cultures used was primarily for agriculture. They developed writing systems mainly based on hieroglyphics. And a lot of their histories were still passed down orally, so there's not always a great written history with these early cultures, but they did have writing systems. Early cultures believed in multiple deities, many based in nature. So they didn't say there was just one God. They believed there were lots of gods, many of them based on items in nature that they depended on for survival. Religion also included shamanistic elements as well as human sacrifice and self-mutilation. So people would cut themselves to tell a god that they were making this sacrifice, or they would kill themselves to make the sacrifice. And an example would be if they hadn't had rain in a while. People may think, oh, the rain gods are asking for a sacrifice. So people would cut themselves to make themselves bleed, and that blood would be their sacrifice via self-mutilation. Or they would just kill themselves and say, I'm sacrificing my whole self so that my community will get rain and can continue going on. And so that was one aspect of the religion. And the shamanistic elements let you know that these early cultures believed that their shamans certain people chosen in their culture were able to communicate with the spirit world. And so the shamans may have even said, oh, the rain god is demanding a sacrifice. And so then someone would either volunteer themselves or be volunteered by a leader. And so religion during that time in Mesoamerica for these early cultures did involve many deities, shamanistic elements, and human sacrifice and self-mutilation were common as well. The ball game was something that was played by most early civilizations. So there's evidence of courts and supplies for this game through most of the early cultures. And it involved keeping a rubber ball in motion. Different cultures used different ways to do that. Some would hit it with their hips, some would hit it with the hand, some had rackets, some hit it with their head. But the basic goal was to keep the ball in motion. And it was played often for fun, even by children. So it was something people grew up playing and it was fun for them. However, there were formal games that had ritual significance. So sometimes they would have a ball game that would be a formal game, and basically the losers of this game were going to be a human sacrifice. And so these formal games also had a religious significance as well as being something that was supposed to be fun. And again, most people still played it for fun, but there were times where it was used as a religious ritual instead of just a game. Two important early civilizations in Mesoamerica were the Olmecs and the Chavin culture. The Olmecs were the first complex civilization in Mesoamerica, existing from around 1400 BC to 400 BC. So there were other civilizations before now, but this is the first one considered a complex civilization. They had the water-supported agriculture. They were staying in one spot. They were developing writing. They were domesticating animals. They had religion, and of course, they played the ball game. So they were best known for their artwork. So once a civilization gets to settle down in one spot and have some free time, that's usually when they start developing artwork. And the Olmecs were best known for this artwork, and theirs involved large and elaborate stone carvings, including the colossal heads. And so these were basically giant heads that had almond-shaped eyes and downturned mouths, and they were much larger heads that would normally be proportionate on a body. And they were very intricately carved. Different stones were used. Sometimes they used jade, sometimes they used green stone, sometimes they just used whatever clay, anything that they had around. But some were done very intricately and polished and had different jewels embedded in them. And so their artwork was very impressive, and the colossal heads are something unique to the Olmecs. The Chavin culture developed in the Andes mountain region in present-day Peru. So where the Olmecs were more in central Mesoamerica, the Chavin culture was along the western coast in the Andes mountains, and if you think about where present-day Peru is, and then along the nearby coastline. So they actually were a civilization that was going to have access to water and would be more involved with fishing. They existed from around 900 BC to 200 BC, and the Chavin built intricate temples and pyramids using metallurgy to add gold to their design. So while this wasn't a culturally important thing where they just depended on the gold, they did find a way to use it and incorporate it into their temples and pyramids. They also developed drainage systems to keep their temples from flooding and being destroyed. So they knew they were going to have a rainy season, and when that happened, water got really high because it rained for so long. And so they built drainage systems underneath their temples, and so all the water would drain down underneath the temple, preserving it, letting it not flood and slowly be destroyed. The water just drained away. So that was something that was unique to the Chavin culture at that time. So there were many early cultures in Mesoamerica. Two of the best known early cultures were the Olmecs and the Chavin culture. And different characteristics of all the early cultures were water-supported agriculture, a writing system based on hieroglyphics, and religion based on multiple deities, as well as the ball game, which was found in most early civilizations. The Middle Ages, feudalism. Feudalism was the system of social and economic organization that developed in Europe during the Middle Ages, approximately from 750 to 1300. Feudalism was based on the exchange of land for military service. So one person would say, hey, I'm going to give you control of this land if you come and help me fight if someone comes and tries to fight against me. And so whenever they pledged that military service, they got control of this land, and those people getting control of the land were going to have a little bit more power than they had before. Rigid hierarchies were established among various classes. Everyone owed allegiance, so that military allegiance that we talked about, everyone owed allegiance to the king above everyone else, and then they owed allegiance to their immediate superior. And I'll explain that a little more after we talk about the classes. So at the top of the hierarchy, we have the king. The king ruled the entire country. Now the king got there because several people supported him and said, hey, we want this guy to be in charge. We're going to fight until we overthrow the last king. Or if there was a dispute over who should be king, we beat out anyone else who is trying to become king. Sometimes there was a clear succession and everyone was happy with that. Sometimes there was a king that wasn't ruling very fairly, so people wanted to overthrow him. And sometimes there wasn't a clear succession, so several people would pop up and say, oh, I want to be king. So whoever wanted to be king was going to have the allegiance of several other people and the people following them so that they could get themselves into that position. Now, lords oversaw smaller areas of land. So lords would be in charge of a smaller area than the entire country, but they would still be in charge of a pretty big chunk of land. So the king is technically in charge of the whole country. Well, the king has to reward those people that fought to get him into this position or are still supporting him and keeping him in that position. So let's say the king said, all right, I've got 10 main lords. They all really were helping me out while I tried to become king. They've been really supportive. I'm going to split my country into 10 different sections, and each lord is going to be manager of that section. And so that's how they became a lord. They were given that plot of land directly from the king. Now, underneath the lords, we have vassals and sub-vassals. So remember, if you've got a whole country and you just split it into 10 pieces of land, those pieces of land are still really big. So the lords would grant control of farmland in exchange for allegiance to vassals. And in turn, the vassals would grant farmland to sub-vassals. So each person is going to be granting out some of their land to other people so that those other people will grant them allegiance in their particular area so that if anyone else tries to come in, the sub-vassals are going to help the vassals fight to keep their land, the vassals are going to help the lords fight to keep their land, and the lords are going to help the king fight to keep his land, the whole country. Now the land managed by each vassal was known as a fief, and the home of the vassal was known as the manor. So the manor may be on just one part of this big piece of land, and the land of one lord was going to be pretty big, and the lord's manor might be in one spot, and then it's going to have fiefs split up in that one lordship because each vassal is going to be in charge of a different section. So it keeps getting divvied out to more and more people so that there are a lot of people involved here. And it gets kind of confusing and could be a little tricky because a lord in one of those original 10 sections we talked about could become a vassal to another lord and have a fief in one of the other sections outside of his own, so that he would be both a lord and a vassal, and vice versa. Some of these sub-vassals may have owed allegiance to a vassal in one area, but also to a vassal in another area, or they could have been lord in another area. So it wasn't just that cut and dry. Some people had a lot of land in different areas instead of just land in one area that they were controlling. So it got a little confusing. Keep moving down the hierarchy. We've got peasants. The peasants were free farmers. So they were going to work on this farmland of the vassals and sub-vassals, the people who were actually given some control of the land. They were free. They should have gotten paid for their work, but they didn't own the land themselves. And last we have serfs. And they were basically slaves who were forced to work for the lords and vassals. So they didn't own any land. They weren't really owned by anyone, but because they had nothing of their own, if they wanted to be fed, if they wanted shelter, they were going to have to work for the vassals and sub-vassals in order to live, to have any kind of a way of life, to have a roof over their head and food to eat. Where the peasants maybe had their own home, and had some kind of status, but they didn't have their own land. They didn't have claim to any land that they were in control of. Now this was a hierarchy that you could move up in. So if you were born as a serf, you may negotiate with your with a sub-vassal who controlled your land, and you may say, okay, well, if I can produce this much in my area of the field that I'm responsible for, could I have my freedom? Could I be able to build a house over there? And if the vassal said, okay, sure, then the serf could move up to be a peasant, and then they're a free farmer. Now, these sub-vassals may say, oh man, I've got lots of land and want to divvy it up some more. So a peasant, one of the free farmers, could become a sub-vassal if they were really good at managing the field. If they had become kind of the lead peasant in the area, they may become a sub-vassal if the vassal over their fief had said, okay, I want to split this up. Now you're going to be in charge here, and I'm going to split my area up into more sections. The sub-vassals could continue to move up and expand and be in charge of more land. Vassals could become lords if the king bestowed some land on them themselves, if basically they owed allegiance to no one other than the king. And then the really influential lords would aspire to become king themselves. And again, that could be different ways. If the king died without a logical successor, then one of the lords may step in and say, oh, I'd like to be king. And if they had allegiance from other lords and vassals and sub-vassals, then it would be easy for them to swoop in and take over that kingship. So, this is the hierarchy from kings, lords, vassals and sub-vassals, peasants and serfs. You could move up in this system even if you started as a serf. So, it was nice in that way that the classes weren't you weren't stuck in a class that you were born into. You could move up if you aspired to do that and you were a hard worker and you had a little luck. Now, feudalism was based on trusting the classes below you. You had to trust that the classes below you would actually follow through on their vows of allegiance. If you were a lord and your vassal said, oh yes, we're going to support you if someone invades your lands. Well, if someone invaded the lands and your vassals didn't support you, then you might have lost some of your lands because you had you were depending on them. You were trusting them to be there for you. And that didn't always work out very well because there was no guarantee on contracts between lords and vassals. Nobody enforced them. So the king said, hey, I'm giving all these lords land. But after that, the lords would say, okay, I'm giving all these vassals lands. Okay, the vassals split it up into sub-vassals and so on and so forth. Well, no one enforced these contracts between them. So if someone didn't perform the military service they were supposed to, the vassal could go after their sub-vassal, or the lord could go after that vassal and try to replace him with someone else. But if the lord had lost his land in the process, it didn't really do any good. Many lords and vassals had pledged allegiance to more than one lord and or liege lord. One of the things that came about were liege lords. You would say, okay, I know that I'm a sub-vassal in Section 1 of the country, and in Section 2, and in Section 5, but my liege lord is going to be the lord in Section 1 right underneath the king. That's my liege lord. Now, some people said, well, I'm going to pledge allegiance to the lords in Section 1, 2, and 5, and the king. Everyone pledged allegiance to the king. And then they might also say, oh, my liege lord, Section 1 lord, you're going to be my liege lord. But then they may travel to Section 5 and say, oh, really, you're going to be my liege lord. Well, you can't say that that's who you're going to pledge allegiance to above all to more than one person. So whenever it came time to fight, you were either fighting for Section 1 or Section 5 if they were against each other. And one of those two lords was going to be disappointed whenever you didn't show up to fight for them with all of the people that you were controlling. So it got a little tricky there, and there was no guarantee that the people that you made your vassals and sub-vassals were actually going to follow through for you. You just had to pick people that you thought you could trust. And often the stronger, more influential lords simply took over land and demanded allegiance from those who had previously managed there. So they could be stronger in that they were wealthier. They could be just more influential because they were regarded more highly than some of the other groups. They could be a group or a lord that was just really persuasive. He was a really good leader. There were different reasons that certain lords were able to attract more followers than others, but in any case, they would take over land, and it wasn't land that was given to them or that was in some kind of a contract between the lords and vassals. It was just that they went in, took it over, and then whoever had been managing there before, they said, okay, you owe us your allegiance now or else. And so often the people who lived there would say, okay, you've got my allegiance, I don't really have another choice. Well, if you've just conquered this person and they're saying they're going to pledge allegiance to you, it probably isn't likely that they're really wanting to fight for you since you just conquered them. So that was another way that this was definitely not a guarantee. If you conquer someone and take over their land, they're not probably going to be real willing to fight for you after that. So there was that little problem too. So feudalism was based on trading land for military service, and there was a hierarchy to it where serfs were basically slaves that didn't own anything that worked on the land. Peasants were free farmers that worked on the land. Sub-vassals controlled a small amount of farmland and reported to a vassal. The vassal controlled sub-vassals and a larger amount of land, reported to the lords. The lords controlled the vassals, larger amount of land, and everyone reported to the king. They all owed their allegiance to him. There were problems with feudalism because when they were trading land for military service, there was no guarantee that that military service would be followed through on whenever it was actually needed. So feudalism did last for a while. It was the major social and economic organization during this time period, but it eventually fizzled out because there was no guarantee and there was no one to enforce the basics of feudalism. There was no one there enforcing the contracts between lord and vassal, and so trading land for military service didn't always work out. Islam. Islam is a religion founded by Muhammad in 610. Islam is based on the Quran, and the Quran is a book of scripture according to the Muslim god Allah. Islam is also based on the 5 pillars, and these 5 pillars are laid out in the Quran. And they are 5 things that every Muslim must do throughout their life. One is faith in Allah. So they must have faith in their God. Another is a pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. This is a holy city for Muslims, and even Muslims that are living in America today are expected to make a pilgrimage to the city of Mecca as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. A yearly fast during the month of Ramadan. The month of Ramadan is the 9th month in an Islamic calendar, and adults that are healthy are expected to fast from dawn until sunset. So anytime that the sun is out, they're not supposed to eat or drink. Now, if someone is sick or elderly or pregnant, then they are exempt from fasting. Though they are supposed to make up the days later. If it is a situation like if they're traveling, that's another exemption, but they should make up the days after they're done traveling. And they are allowed to eat and drink before sunrise and after sunset. So it's not that they aren't eating or drinking for an entire month, it's just that during daytime hours from dawn to sunset, they are fasting. And they're supposed to use the time of fasting to reflect, to pray more, to empathize with people who don't have as much, and possibly do some generous works. Another of the 5 pillars is the giving of alms. So donations to others who are needier than themselves. And the last pillar is prayer 5 times a day. So some people may pray more than that, but they're supposed to pray at least 5 times a day in the Islamic religion. So those are the basics of Islam. It was founded by Muhammad in 610, who was a prophet, and based on the Quran, a book of scripture that is supposed to be the direct words from God, their God, Allah. And their religion is based on 5 pillars found in the Quran that include having faith in Allah, a pilgrimage to Mecca, a fast during Ramadan, the giving of alms, and praying 5 times a day. Now, Muhammad said that Islam should be spread all around the world. And this is something that was also in the Christian religion, that Christianity should be spread all over the world. So you can imagine that 2 religions, both focused on one true God, might not get along too well, and there may be some tension because each religion, each group of followers that are practicing that religion, are going to feel that their God is the one true God and aren't going to look fondly upon anyone saying something different. So, as the Christian church was becoming dominant in Europe, Islam spread throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and to parts of Asia, and even to parts of Spain. So Christianity had spread throughout Europe because it developed in an area closer to Europe, and Islam spread to North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia and Spain because that was where Islam was closer. But those 2 areas are still very close to each other, so there was some tension. And the simultaneous development of the 2 religions led to large-scale conflict most notably during the Crusades. So Islam started out in 610. It spent a while developing and spreading around the world, and it took 3 or 4 centuries, but then they developed what will become known as the Islamic Empire. The Renaissance. In the 14th century, the turmoil caused by war and plague weakened the power of Christianity. People were surrounded by so much death and destruction with war and plague that they kind of gave up on the hope of an afterlife, on the belief in God, and they instead turned to something else. In its place came the philosophy of humanism, where emphasis is placed on individual potential and determination. So instead of focusing on an afterlife provided by a deity, people focused on the talents of individuals here on earth. Humanist thought led to a resurgence in the arts and sciences, which eventually came to be known as the Renaissance. So this period in the 14th and 15th century, after the war and plague had weakened Christianity, was known as the Renaissance because it was a time when people were putting a lot of focus on what the individual could do, on individual ideas, on individual works of art, on individual writings, and this period was known as the Renaissance. The center of the Renaissance was in northern Italy, mainly because this area was the crossroads of several important trade routes. Since all these routes were going to be crossing there for trade anyway, they became big areas for the arts and sciences as well. Talented youths typically studied in the cities of Milan, Florence, and Venice, which are cities in northern Italy. Their expenses were often paid by wealthy patrons, so they're patrons of the arts who wanted to make sure the youths had plenty of time to use their individual talents without having to worry about how they were going to eat or where they were going to live. So these patrons would pay for them, and then they could take a little bit of credit for the art that these people provided. The most famous of these patrons were the Medici family, who were located in Florence. Now, some of the famous artists to emerge at this time were Donatello. He was around from 1386 to 1466, so 14th, 15th century, and he sculpted a marvelous David, making him the first artist in this period to depict the naked human body. And this was because religious concerns had kept recent artists from doing so. So the David that you were used to probably seeing as the most famous David wasn't Donatello's, but Donatello did the first David, which was a sculpture of David in the nude, and it was the first time during this period that an artist had rendered a naked human body, because religious concerns had kept them from doing that, thinking they would have ramifications from the church. But Christianity had been weakened and people were focusing more on the human side of things, so it was accepted at this time. Botticelli painted the Birth of Venus during the Renaissance, and he was around 15th, 16th century. Then Leonardo da Vinci excelled in a number of fields, but he's probably most famous for painting the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Those are paintings almost everyone has seen a representation of, if not the exact original, but those were done by Leonardo da Vinci during this period. Michelangelo, for all the fame that Leonardo da Vinci had, Michelangelo was probably the most famous painter and sculptor during this time because he painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and sculpted the most famous David. So the David that you have probably seen is most likely Michelangelo's David and not Donatello's David. But Donatello opened the door for people to start painting the naked human form as an acceptable art form. So these were the most famous artists of this time. But even though the Renaissance is most often associated with art, the period also saw a large amount of literary and scientific talent. One of the most significant works from this time was The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, who was also from Florence, one of those northern Italy cities. And this book outlined a practical plan for political management. And this plan was one that many ruthless leaders would attempt to emulate in the future. They would look back at Machiavelli's The Prince, and they would try to use that political management plan in their own countries. Other noteworthy authors were Erasmus, who wrote In Praise of Folly, Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, Montaigne, Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and of course William Shakespeare, who I'm sure you've heard or read one or more of his plays. So these were some of the famous authors to come out of the Renaissance period. And you can see, at least by Machiavelli, he was from Florence, and a lot of these other people would have been talented individuals who wealthy patrons would have paid for so they could have all their time to work on writing, and they probably would have been in one of these towns in northern Italy. At the same time, remarkable advances were being made in the sciences. Copernicus invited controversy by suggesting that the Earth revolved around the sun. And since people had previously thought the sun was revolving around the earth, this invited lots of controversy. People did not like to have the belief that they'd believed for so long thrown out the window, much the same as people believing the world was round instead of flat around the time that Columbus sailed. And then Kepler and Galileo would acquire hard data to support his claim later during the Renaissance. So there were remarkable leaps being made in science as well. So the Renaissance was a period in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, right after war and plague had caused so much turmoil in the area, and they had made people doubt Christianity. They weren't believing in God as much. They weren't practicing Christianity as much. They'd lost hope, and they didn't practice that anymore because there had seen so much death and destruction. So it wasn't that it was gone completely. There were still plenty of people practicing it, but it was declining. It wasn't as popular as it had been before, or as strong as it had been before. And so people turned to humanism and focused instead on the talent of the individual. And this period, known as the Renaissance, gave us several advances in art, science, and literature. The Reformation. The Protestants. Inspired by Martin Luther, many other critics of the Catholic Church's practices joined together throughout Europe. These groups were known collectively as the Protestants. So Martin Luther kind of kicked off the Reformation, where the Protestants split off from the Roman Catholic Church, but many other critics of the Catholic Church came forward and followed in his footsteps. And all of the groups that criticized and were against the Catholic Church's practices became known collectively as the Protestants. So whether they were against the Roman Catholic Church's practices for different reasons, they were still going to be referred to as Protestants. There just came to be many different denominations within the Protestant Church. So these reformers spoke out against the sale of indulgences which was when the church would say, okay, if you pay us this much money, we can knock this much time off of your time in purgatory, or if you pay us this much money, you can go straight to heaven without any time in purgatory. So they were basically selling a way into heaven, which not most, but a lot of people disagreed with, and they started speaking out against that. They didn't think it was right for the church to try to make money off of religion that way. And they also didn't believe that that was a possibility, that you could pay your way to heaven. They also spoke out against the following of arbitrary rules as the only path to heaven. So the church had its certain rules and how you were supposed to approach God and how you were supposed to behave and the good works you were supposed to do. And these reformers had different ideas. For instance, Martin Luther believed that the path to heaven was through faith. Having faith in God and repenting of your sins and reforming yourself was going to be your way into heaven, not paying your way there. There are other denominations we'll discuss, and they believed something a little bit different about the path to getting into heaven. But following the arbitrary rules and participating in the sale of indulgences or the sale of high-ranking church positions were all practices that the Protestants disagreed with and were very critical of toward the Roman Catholic Church. The many reformers quickly began to disagree amongst themselves. So remember I said there were different paths to heaven that different denominations believed in? Well, once they said, we all don't agree with the Catholic Church. We all think they're doing it wrong. Well, within the Protestant Church and within this group of people that said we think the Catholic Church is doing it wrong, there were lots of different ideas about how it was to do it right. So they began to disagree amongst themselves, and they divided up into different groups based on their doctrinal beliefs. So based on what they believed Scripture to be saying, based on how they believed people got to heaven, based on how they believed people should worship God. And this resulted in the formation of different and rival Protestant churches. If people believed one thing, that might mean they couldn't believe something that another group believed, so they would have to form their own group. If they believed, as everyone else did, that the indulgences were wrong, but they still believed that you should have someone else to talk to God for you, like the clergy did in the Catholic Church, then they may go to a different group. If they believed that you could get to heaven through faith, you might go in a different group. If you believed you can go to heaven through predestination, you can go to a different group. And there were just lots of different beliefs that could come up, and everyone had to split into different denominations, different groups within the Protestant Church so that they could practice what they believed. Denominations such as the Lutherans, so those who believed what Martin Luther had to say and followed him. The Reformed, which were also known as the Calvinists, the Puritans, and the Presbyterians came into being. And there were more, but these are some of the more prominent denominations that came into being around this time based on different disputes they had among the religious doctrines that each different group held. One of the largest sects of Protestants were the Calvinists. So those that are also known as the Reformed. And they were named after their founder, John Calvin. And this group, the Calvinists, believed in predestination. So this would mean that faith alone wasn't going to get you into heaven. Doing good works alone wasn't going to get you into heaven. Buying indulgences wasn't going to get you into heaven. They believed that God has already decided each person's eternal destiny. So God already knows which people will be going to heaven, and God already knows which people will be going to hell. And so that is one of the primary beliefs in Calvinism. The Calvinists also believed that only the elect would join him, God, in heaven. And the elect were the group who was chosen to go to heaven. Everyone else would be not the elect, and they would be going to hell. And at this time, most of the Calvinists who joined and said, okay, I want to be a Calvinist, I believe in this, thought of themselves as a group, as part of the elect. They didn't join the religion thinking, oh, I'm definitely predestined to go to hell. They said, oh, I'm sure I'm part of the elect. I need to be in the Calvinist group. I need to go and join that denomination. So primarily the people who were joining the Calvinist group at this time were people who believed that they were in the elect, that they would be going to heaven. Most people aren't going to join a religion thinking that if they join this religion, if they believe this set of beliefs, they're going to go to hell. Most people are joining believing they're going to go to heaven if they follow that path. Anglicanism rose in England with the English Reformation. So the reason that England kind of branched off from the Catholic Church was a little different, but it happened when King Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church after his request for a marriage annulment from Catherine of Aragon was denied by the Pope. So King Henry's married. He says, I don't want to be married to this person anymore. I'm going to take a different wife. And he requested that his marriage be annulled so he could marry a different woman. And the Pope said, no, you can't do that. You have to stay married to Catherine of Aragon. Well, King Henry said, nope, not happening. So he established the Church of England with himself as leader. And then he was able to have as many annulments as he would like. And he had 5 more wives before his death. So his reason wasn't as pure. It wasn't a path to heaven type reason. He left because he disagreed with the Catholic Church, but it wasn't over something doctrinal. It was more over something that was of particular interest to him, something that affected his life. And so that was his reason for starting the Church of England, so that he could be separate from the Catholic Church and could have what he wanted. And all of these reformers together sped up the process of the Counter-Reformation by the Catholic Church. So the Protestants were the group as a whole, the group of groups, if you will, that were opposed to the Catholic Church's practices at this time. But together, all these different people grouping together saying, we don't like what the Catholic Church is doing, spurred the Counter-Reformation by the Catholic Church, which is where they would try to change some things to get more people coming back to the Catholic faith instead of moving into one of these Protestant denominations. The Reformation, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German friar who first became famous for criticizing the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. And indulgences were when members in the Catholic Church would say, okay, if you give us money to rebuild this part of the church, or to pay for this or that, or just for the church to have more money in general, then you won't spend as much time in purgatory, or you'll go straight to heaven, or more of your sins will be forgiven without any penance. Instead of asking forgiveness from God, they were saying, oh, I'll pay this money to the church, and the church will clear all of my debt with God. They will make sure that I go straight to heaven, or that I won't spend as long in purgatory if I pay this money to them. And since the church really didn't have any jurisdiction over that, this was a problem for some people, because the church was making money off of something that they were promising to people that they could not guarantee. So Martin Luther was one of the people who had a problem with this practice, and he wrote a critique of Catholic clerical abuses, especially the sale of indulgences. Now, that wasn't the only thing people had a problem with in the Catholic Church. They were also, they would take land as payment for the indulgences, and then they would sell the land and make money, or they would keep the land and have the church own it. They would also sell the different offices in the church. If there was a high-ranking church member or clerical member, that position available, then people could say, oh, I'll give you this land, or I'll pay you some money so that I can have that position, because the church is very much a part of the political society during that day. So there were other things that people had a problem with within the church, but the sale of indulgences was one of the big ones, especially for Martin Luther. So this critique that he wrote quickly spread throughout Germany and the rest of Europe. So pretty much everyone in Europe was reading it, and a lot of people were saying, yeah, I agree with a lot of what he's saying. The church shouldn't be selling these indulgences. That Martin Luther is on to something. So this document became known as the 95 Theses. And it won him immediate fame. If it was spreading that quickly all throughout his own country and then all throughout the rest of Europe, it was something that was very popular, and it made Martin Luther a name that a lot of people throughout Europe were going to know. Luther then set about undermining the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. He was unhappy with the practices of the church, and if they weren't going to reform them, then he was going to try to undermine the institution of the church and tell people there was another way, and go against what the church was constantly telling people was the only way. So he argued that individuals did not need the help of the clergy to establish a strong relationship with God. At this time, people weren't encouraged to talk to God on their own. They were encouraged to tell the different clerical workers, the different people that worked within the church. They were supposed to talk to these different clergymen, and they were supposed to tell them what they wanted God to know, and then the clergymen were supposed to pass that on up. So your deacons, your priests, they were supposed to be relaying this message to God from the common people, instead of encouraging the common people to talk to God themselves. So people at this time, if they were part of the Roman Catholic Church, they were basically under the belief that they needed the clergy to be able to talk to God, to make sure that God heard them. And if you paid more money, then it would be more likely that God would hear you. And that was the kind of thing that the church was telling people. So Luther maintained that faith, rather than obedience to arbitrary church rules, would be what got people into heaven. So if you had faith in God, if you repented of your sins to God directly, then that was what would get you into heaven. You wouldn't have to follow the church's arbitrary rules. You wouldn't have to pay them so much money. You wouldn't have to do so many good works for the church or in honor of the church in order to get into heaven. It wasn't based on like an exact amount of work or money paid that you would get into heaven or get out of purgatory quicker. Luther maintained that it was your faith, what you believed, that was going to get you to heaven, and not what you were doing according to the church's rules and regulations. Now, the final straw for the church was when Luther directly challenged the Pope. So the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, had a lot of power, and Luther directly challenged him, declaring that no one man could be the perfect interpreter of Scripture. So it was a big deal for Martin Luther to challenge the Pope like that, and he'd already written the 95 Theses. He'd already written a lot against the church, but this was the final straw for the church. And Luther was saying no man could be the perfect interpreter of Scripture, because everyone would just take the Pope's interpretation as this is what the Scripture means. But the Pope is no more qualified to understand it than anyone else who's able to read and come up with an interpretation. So At this time, a lot of the people couldn't read the Bible because the Bible was still written in Latin. It hadn't been translated. And so people had to go with what they were told about Scripture, what the interpretation of the Scripture was that was presented to them, because they didn't have another option. But when the only option being presented was that of the Pope, Martin Luther didn't like that idea. He wanted people to be able to gain their own interpretations of Scripture. So after Luther challenged the Pope and refused to recant any of his published statements, so he was given the option to take back what he'd said. He could take back his challenge, he could take back a lot of the statements in the 95 Theses and some of his other writings, and he could have been forgiven by the church. But Martin Luther didn't want to be forgiven by the church. He wanted the church to change. He wanted the Reformation to start. So he was excommunicated from the church. He refused to take back any of his statements or his challenge. Now, he did say, I stand by my statements. I did write them. And he thought about it for a while. He said, let me think about if I want to take them back. But he came to the conclusion that he couldn't, because that was what he truly believed, and it would be a lie to try to take it back, and he was going to let God judge him for his statements and not the Pope. And so he maintained he believed all those statements. He was standing firmly behind them. And so the Pope said, okay, you're excommunicated from the church. And even though he wasn't any longer part of the Roman Catholic Church, which was a big deal, Luther continued to spread his message. So some of the legacies that we get from Martin Luther are that those who identified with Luther's teachings and became his followers were called Lutherans. And this continues even today. There are Lutheran churches who base their belief system primarily on ideas that came from Martin Luther. Luther wrote many hymns that greatly contributed to the development of singing in churches. So there wasn't a lot of singing in church or in church services before Martin Luther came around. And he wrote so many hymns that encouraged singing and that were worshiping God that more people started singing in churches, and this tradition spread. Likewise, Luther got married, which further promoted the practice and acceptance of clerical marriage. At this time, in the Roman Catholic Church, priests were not allowed to get married. And so if you were a priest, if you were a church leader, you weren't allowed to take a wife. And so Martin Luther didn't believe that that was something that was based in Scripture. He didn't believe that there was anywhere in the Bible that was telling religious leaders that they shouldn't get married, because God had created Eve for Adam and wanted man and woman to be together, and so he believed that it was still fine for a man who was a religious leader to get married. So when Luther himself got married, this further promoted the practice and acceptance of clerical marriage among people that were separating off from the Catholic Church. Now Luther, with the help of some of his peers, translated the entire Bible from Latin to German. Since he was living in Germany, that was his native tongue, and so he knew Latin from studying in school. He was able to read the Bible, but remember, the common person wasn't able to read the Bible because it was written in Latin. So Luther translated the New Testament, and then he got some of his peers to help him, and they translated the Old Testament as well into German. And this made it much more accessible to the public. Now the Bible was available in German, in people's native tongue in Germany, to be able to read it, and then they could go and interpret the Scripture themselves without having to just take the Pope's word for it. They could read for themselves, come up with their own conclusions about what the Scripture meant. So we got lots of legacies from Luther within the church, but the primary one was that he undermined the church's institution, that he went against the church so completely and became so popular that he really divided the Catholic Church and encouraged a lot of people to separate off from the Catholic Church, believing that the sale of indulgences wasn't good and that the path to heaven was through faith and not through following the church's rules. The Reformation. The Counter-Reformation. After being bombarded with Protestant attacks for years, the Catholic Church finally began to make some positive changes. This program was known as the Counter-Reformation, and it was aimed at stopping the spread of Protestantism. So, the Reformation was when people started to speak out against the Catholic Church and say that they didn't like certain things, like the sale of indulgences, which was when people sold a pass into heaven, basically. They would say, if you paid this much, you can go straight to heaven. If you pay this much, you'll shorten your time in purgatory and get to heaven faster. They also sold the local clerical offices. So if there was like a high-ranking church position open, someone could say, oh, I'll pay you this much if I can have that position, because the Catholic Church was also very involved in the politics at this time. So between that and some of the other rules that the Catholic Church had been imparting on people, the Protestants broke off and said, we don't like this, we're going to make our own church, and it's going to not have these things from the Catholic Church that we don't like. And it was baffling to the Catholic Church, and then a little scary to them, how many people flocked to Protestantism, how many parishioners they were losing from the Catholic Church. And so finally, after the Protestants had been attacking their ways and had been taking the congregations from the Catholic Church and converting them into Protestants, the Catholic Church said, okay, we have to do something about this. And what they came up with was the Counter-Reformation, which was a good enough name for it, since the spread of Protestantism was the Reformation. So it was causing the Reformation of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church came up with the Counter-Reformation to say, okay, we're not going to get rid of the Catholic Church, we're just going to make some changes. So one of the ways they came up with these changes was the Council of Trent, which was a 20-year meeting that determined the official Catholic interpretation on all matters of theology. So over a period of 20 years, people met pretty regularly to try to define their official interpretation on all matters of theology. So whenever they were asked, they had a definite answer, and it was supposed to be the same across all of the different individual local churches up to the Pope. The sale of indulgences was halted, and this was one of the biggest peeves that the Protestants had with the Catholic Church, was trying to sell people a pass into heaven, trying to sell them a shorter amount of time in purgatory, trying to let them think that they could buy their way into heaven. And the Protestants were very against this. So pretty early on, the sale of indulgences was stopped, and so that was going to make a lot of people happier right away. More authority was given to local bishops. So at a local level, the church would have more authority there rather than having to defer to the Pope or to other higher-ups for every little thing, because everyone in the Catholic Church was going to know the official interpretation on all things related to theology. The local bishops would know that information as well, and they would have more of a control in their area where they were practicing. The church reaffirmed many of its core teachings. So the church was saying, okay, you know what? A lot of what we are saying, a lot of what we've been teaching is still true. We've just messed up a little bit. So they still said you could earn indulgences. So you could do good works, and that would shave off time off of your time in purgatory. So by doing good things, by pleasing God in different ways here on earth, you could earn indulgences and lose some of the time you'd spend in purgatory and get to heaven faster. But you wouldn't be able to buy that time. And then the church also admitted its errors with regard to simony, which is the sale of church offices, which was another big thing that they didn't like. If there was the high-ranking official in the church, that there was a vacancy for that position, and then it was sold to someone. Someone could pay to be a leader in the church rather than being chosen for someone who was right for that position. So that practice was known as simony, and the church admitted its errors with regard to simony. They said that was wrong, that isn't what we should have been doing, we're going to stop. And they also admitted some other abuses of clerical power, mainly regarding money, and they quickly remedied those errors. So the sale of indulgences stopped, the sale of offices stopped, and those were two of the big things that the Protestant didn't like. So people that had converted to Protestantism were going to be saying, okay, things are looking better in the Catholic Church. One of the most influential men of this movement was Sir Ignatius Loyola, and he was a Spaniard who founded the Society of Jesus, and members of the Society of Jesus were known as the Jesuits. And the Jesuits' job was to promote the Catholic interpretation of Scripture. They were supposed to go out. They were supposed to travel throughout the area, and they were supposed to try to reconvert people who had converted to Protestantism back to Catholicism. So people that had left the Catholic Church, the Jesuits were supposed to try to talk to them, tell them about the new official interpretation of Scripture, tell them about the changes in the Catholic Church, tell them how the Catholic Church was changing for the better, and try to get them to convert back to Catholicism, because the Catholic Church wanted its members back. The Counter-Reformation also saw the reemergence of the Inquisition, and this was one of the negative changes that came out of the Counter-Reformation, because the Inquisition was when heretics were sought out and punished. So anything the Catholic Church deemed heresy, going against the Bible, going against what they believed, they could seek out those people and punish them, torture them until they admitted what they had done wrong and asked for forgiveness. It wasn't a good change. This was a negative change. And so any areas that were Catholic controlled were going to be able to practice the Inquisition on anyone that was speaking out against them and deemed a heretic. So that in itself would stop the spread of Protestantism, or slow the spread of Protestantism. And so people would either move out of that area so that they weren't in danger, or they would say, you know what, I'm going to keep speaking out against it and know that the Inquisition, I could be a part of the Inquisition if I keep speaking out against the Catholic Church. So it was going to make it a lot riskier to speak out against the Catholic Church, and so that was going to slow down the spread of Protestantism. The stopping of the sale of indulgences and the stopping of simony, the admission of errors in the church, all of those things help make people feel better about the Catholic Church. The negative feelings weren't there as much. So there were a lot of good things to come out of the Counter-Reformation that people were going to appreciate with the Catholic Church. But what the Counter-Reformation was just the church's response to all the Protestant attacks. It was the church's way of saying, okay, some of the things we did were wrong. We're going to change them. We want you to come back and be a part of this church. The Scientific Revolution. The rapid advance in learning, known as the Scientific Revolution, was largely a product of the systematic form of inquiry known as the scientific method. So the scientific method provided a way for people to learn things more systematically and be able to share that learning with other people so that they didn't have to repeat the learning themselves. With the scientific method, learning is incremental. A question is posed, a hypothetical solution is formed, observations are made, and the hypothesis is either supported or refuted. So learning is a step-by-step systematic process with a scientific method. There is a method to learning with this. You have a question that's posed. How is something done? How could we make this better? And you come up with a hypothetical solution or your hypothesis for what you think will happen if you do these experiments, for how you think you can fix it, and then you try out your different experiments and one at a time, try out an experiment, observe the results, and after a series of these experiments, you can decide whether the hypothesis is either supported or refuted. Often the hypothesis is then going to be tweaked. You're going to adjust it one way or another and then do more experiments and see if the observations prove that your new hypothesis is correct or incorrect. And it's just a very systematic way to get accurate results and come up with an accurate solution for a problem. And in that way, people learned a lot of different things during the scientific revolution. The consistency of the method, you're using the same steps each time, made it easy for scientific discoveries to be transferred from one country to another. So if one person said, I used the scientific method, I came to this discovery, someone else in another country could do the exact same experiment. They could say, okay, they came up with this hypothesis, I'm going to test it, watch the observations, and see if I agree with them. The person who is coming up with this discovery has already tested it lots of times before he announces it as a discovery. So whenever someone else goes to test it, because the scientific method is so consistent, they should get the same results that the original discoverer did. Along with a standardized form of measurement, the development of the scientific method gave scientists a common language. So, even if they didn't speak the same language, even if they weren't from the same country, all of the scientists at this time were using the same standardized form of measurement, so the measurements would translate from one country to another without having to do any new calculations, and they were using the scientific method. So it wasn't exactly a language, but it meant that everyone was conducting their scientific experiments the same way. They would pose a question. They would say, okay, this is what I think will happen, or this is what I think will be a good solution. They perform a series of experiments, observe the results, and see if that hypothesis is correct or incorrect, and if they need to adjust it. And so by having every scientist do this, that was a common process, a common system, and so it became like a common language for them. Scientists also benefited from the development of powerful telescopes and microscopes. So when they were conducting these experiments, when they were trying to observe results and see if their hypotheses were true or false, they had these new powerful devices to use as well, and that advanced the learning during the scientific revolution. There were several key figures in the scientific revolution. We talked about scientists making these discoveries. Well, these were some of the important scientists and some other people who relied on science for their philosophical ideas. So let's look at a few. Copernicus startled the world when he theorized that the Earth revolved around the sun. Since that is how we are used to hearing it, that makes sense. But at the time, this challenged the geocentric model of the universe that was widely accepted at the time. Most people, pretty much all people, believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything else was just working around the Earth. But Copernicus, after observing things, said, I don't think that's right. I think that really the Earth is revolving around the sun, and maybe some other things are too. And so he came up with this new theory that really just startled everyone. It surprised them because it wasn't anything they were used to hearing. And then the Italian, Galileo, supplied scientific experiments that proved Copernicus's theory was accurate. So Copernicus had made so many observations on his own, and then he came up with his theory. He announced it. And then Galileo came along and produced different scientific experiments that would support Copernicus's claim, and it would make other people be able to believe it more easily, and that idea slowly matriculated and became more accepted. Now, it wasn't easy at first because a lot of people were used to what they believed. It would be like if today someone told you, oh, actually the Earth doesn't revolve around the sun, the Earth revolves around Mars. You would not think that was accurate because of everything you've learned so far. And you would probably need a lot of scientific experiments and other evidence that was going to show you that it was different. So the people at that time needed that to let them know that Copernicus's theory was actually correct. Now, one of the philosophical heroes of the scientific revolution was the Frenchman René Descartes. And he attempted to base his beliefs about the world on provable facts. So he was a philosopher, but he only wanted to base his philosophies on provable facts. He didn't want it to just be ideas based on what he thought. He wanted it to be ideas based on provable facts, on evidence that he could show to support his philosophies. And one of his most widely known sayings is, I think, therefore I am. And the simple explanation for that is just, if you are thinking about if you exist, then you obviously must exist because there is an I to do the doubting about the existence in the first place. So it's a little cyclical, but that was his way of saying, if you are able to think about the fact that you might not exist, then you definitely do exist. And so he tried to use logic like that and other provable facts to support his different philosophies. Francis Bacon was an English intellectual who wrote copiously on the possibilities for science to improve the human condition. So, Francis Bacon said the human condition was in bad shape. In general, people weren't living as well as they should be living, and he believed that science was the answer, and he wrote copiously on this. So he relied on science, and he was promoting science as the answer to advancing the human condition and making life better for people. And then Sir Isaac Newton excelled in many different fields, but he's best known for his theories on motion and gravity. Newton helped create the idea that objects in the world behave in regular and predictable ways. For instance, if I let go of this marker, it would fall. And that is because we know about the force of gravity on Earth, and this marker or anything I was holding would fall if I let go of it, because that's how gravity works. And so this object would behave in a regular and predictable way in regular conditions. So the scientific revolution was perpetuated by many different figures from all across Europe, but it was basically just an increased spread of learning. There was a lot of learning going on, and this was primarily based on people starting to use the scientific method. The Enlightenment. Between the years 1600 and 1770, social and political philosophy in Europe went through a drastic change known collectively as the Enlightenment. So there was a lot of social and political change. There were a lot of philosophers and different theorists that promoted this change, and collectively this time period where all this social and political change was happening became known as the Enlightenment. Just as northern Italy had been the center of the Renaissance, Paris became the major hub of progressive thought. Which made it basically the hub for this period known as the Enlightenment. The philosophers who strive to bring every subject under the authority of reason consisted of both deists, those who believed in God, and atheists, those who did not. So there were many philosophers, and they were all trying to bring every subject that could come up under reason. They wanted to have a reason for these things and not just thoughts that came up out of their minds. They wanted actual reason for them. And these philosophers were both deists who believed in God and atheists who didn't believe in God. So no matter what their religious beliefs or their beliefs about God, they were all looking for a reason. So the people who believed in God and the people who did not were still looking for a reason behind their philosophies instead of just coming up with them and basing them on faith. The study known as political science first developed during this period. And political science was whenever people started actually studying the ins and outs of politics and what worked best. So intellectuals began to question the divine right claimed by absolute monarchs in the past. So the absolute monarchs ruled pretty much all on their own. Some had something to help them, like the Estates General in France or Parliament in England, but for the most part, the monarch had absolute control. And he or she had that because it was considered their divine right, something that God had given them. So intellectuals started to question these claims by absolute monarchs, these claims that they had a divine right to rule, because they sought to determine which was the best form of government for all citizens of the country. They couldn't prove that God wanted these people to be ruling. There was no reason to this theory or this idea. It was just that people said, this person has the divine right to rule. Or the ruler would come up and say, I have the divine right to rule. I've been chosen by God. This right has been passed down to me if their parents had been monarchs before them. And so this wasn't necessarily the best form of government, and intellectuals began to question the reason behind this practice and then started to look for the best form of government, and this was the beginning of political science. One of the most important figures of the Enlightenment period was the Frenchman Voltaire, who lived from 1694 to 1778. So he lived through a good chunk of the Enlightenment period. And he was important because he challenged the authority of the church. Now, the church had already been challenged a lot at this point, but he was challenging the church, declaring that people should tolerate the views of others and that no one person or group had a monopoly on absolute truth. So he wasn't saying, I think the Catholic Church is wrong, or the Catholic Church is right, or the Protestant Church is wrong or right. He was saying, none of the churches are 100% right. No one has a monopoly on absolute truth. No one knows 100% what the truth is. Everyone is going to have their own beliefs, and everyone should have their views tolerated, no matter what they are. People have a right to believe what they want to believe, and those views should be tolerated and not persecuted. So Voltaire became very important after he started challenging the church and giving out these kind of ideas. Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1598 to 1679, another big chunk of the Enlightenment period, was one of the most influential political theorists of this time. So once political science came about, people started coming up with their political theories. And in his masterpiece, Leviathan, he declared that the base impulses of people had to be restrained by a powerful and just monarch. So he was still kind of leaning toward the old ways. He was saying, you know what? People are going to have these base impulses. Someone has to be there to control them, and it needs to be a powerful and just monarch. There still needs to be a monarch in place with absolute control. Now, he did want a powerful one who could actually control instead of One who was weak. Of course, you're not going to ask for a weak one, but he did point out that it needed to be a powerful monarch and a just monarch. You need one that's fair. If you have a ruler who is very powerful but isn't fair, then that's not going to be a good government system either. So Thomas Hobbes was saying that the monarch system was still the way to go, but it needed to be a powerful and just monarch because the base impulses that people had still needed to be restrained, and you couldn't just have everyone doing whatever they wanted because that wasn't going to work out either. So John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, another good chunk of the Enlightenment period, he kind of went against what Thomas Hobbes said and declared that men were born with natural rights which could not be justly denied them. And if there was an absolute monarch, even if they were considered powerful and just, if they tried to deny people certain natural rights that they were born to, then that would not be justly denying them. Because if they are naturally born with these rights and every person should have them, no one can deny those rights and still consider it to be a just thing, a fair thing. And then Rousseau was a Swiss philosopher, and he asserted that the government only ruled so long as it did so to the satisfaction of the general will of the people. So that a government only ruled, or should only rule, as long as it was actually ruling to the satisfaction of the general will of the people. That in general, people were happy with the way the government was ruling. If the government was not doing a good job, if people were unhappy with it, then the government shouldn't rule anymore. And really, if people stopped respecting their ruler or their government, then they weren't going to be following the rules as well anyway. So the government wouldn't really be ruling as well as it could be if it was well respected and was doing a good job in satisfying what the people wanted. So the Enlightenment period was a big period for social and political change. A lot of political theorists came out at this time. Political science became a study that people were actively looking at and trying to come up with new theories for, trying to come up with the best way to run governments. And it was centered around Paris from the year 1600 to 1770. But the important thing to remember with the Enlightenment period is that it was a big period of political and social change, where other periods, such as the scientific revolution, centered around science and a renewed interest in learning and a growth in learning. The Enlightenment was all about political and social change. It was more about how the countries were being run and the social and political interactions there than anything else. The French Revolution. The Estates General. Before the Revolution, France was governed by an absolute monarch and for matters of taxation, the Estates General. So an absolute monarch had most of the power. This was a monarch or ruler that people believed had a divine right to rule. He or she was chosen by God to rule, and that ruler believed that, and the people, for the most part, believed that and supported them. And the absolute monarch had most of the power, but for matters of taxation, anything with regard to taxation, the Estates General was supposed to be in charge of that. So technically, France was governed by an absolute monarch and the Estates General. The Estates General had been formed in order to represent the common people. So this is supposed to be a group that would represent the common people, people that weren't the ruler. The ruler wanted to make sure, the monarch wanted to make sure that the common people were heard whenever the Estates General was formed. The Estates General was composed of 3 estates. The clergy, so your church officials, and at this time the church was very powerful in regard to its role in politics. The noblemen, or the nobles, and they formed the second estate, and everyone else who formed the third estate. So your church officials, high-ranking church staff, those were going to be your first estate. Nobles, landholders, they're going to be your second estate. And then everyone else, your middle class, some of the merchant class, your peasants, those were all the third estate. Those were the people kind of at the bottom of the totem pole. And they were all three supposed to have an equal voice in the Estates General whom the ruler, the monarch, was supposed to listen to. Unfortunately, the Estates General had been marginalized by a series of powerful monarchs. So there were a series of powerful monarchs, and they made the Estates General less powerful, less important. Their voice wasn't heard as much, which meant that the common people's voice wasn't heard as much. And there was also some tension within the Estates General among those three estates. It was also still arranged such that the largest group by far, which was the third estate, your group of everyone else, middle-class citizens, peasants, some of your merchant class, this large group, the biggest by far, only had 1/3 of the vote. So even though it was making up much more than 1/3 of the people in the Estates General, it was only being counted as 1/3 of the vote. And this group usually found its desires opposed by the other estates. So if the nobles and the clergy both said, we don't think so, we disagree, then the third estate of the middle class and peasants were going to be overruled. 2/3 beats 1/3. And so things weren't working out very well for the third estate, so there was some tension within the Estates General, besides the fact that the whole Estates General as a body had been marginalized and was no longer in a position of very much power at all. Another source of anger for the middle class and peasants, those of the third estate, was the tax structure. So if it wasn't enough that in this marginalized group, the third estate was the marginalized estate, the middle class and the peasants were also unhappy with the tax structure. The clergy and the nobles, those who formed the first and second estates, were not forced to pay taxes. Only everyone in that third estate was required to pay taxes. And so the burden of France's depressed economy fell upon the third estate. So in this time preceding the French Revolution, you have the Estates General at odds with the ruler or the monarch of France. The Estates General doesn't have very much power at all. Within the Estates General, you've got three groups that are at odds with each other, primarily the third estate being against the first and second, both because they aren't having as much of a voice within the Estates General, and they're having to pay taxes that the nobles and clergy aren't required to pay. So there was a lot of unrest within the groups in France, and this can give you an idea of where the Estates General was at the dawn of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the National Assembly. Aware of the injustices of the French tax policy, King Louis XVI tried to pass some reforms. So he wanted to reform the tax code to make it more fair. But he was repeatedly thwarted by the greedy nobles and clergy. The nobles and clergy did not want to change the tax code because under the current tax policy, the nobles and clergy were not required to pay taxes where the peasants were. So they didn't want to change it. King Louis XVI realized that was unfair and tried to change it, but because the nobles and clergy made up 2/3 of the vote in the Estates General, he kept being overruled. The third estate, which was made up of the lower class citizens, the common people, middle, lower class, peasants, anyone that wasn't a noble or a clergyman, was furious. So this third estate was furious and refused to vote in the Estates General anymore. And That makes sense, since the nobles and clergy are almost always going to outvote you, because what the third estate wants is not probably going to be in the best interest of the nobles and clergy. So the nobles and clergy would always band together, outvote the third estate. So finally the third estate said, we're not even going to vote in the Estates General anymore. Instead, prominent members of the middle class, who would have been members of the third estate, they banded together to form the National Assembly, which claimed to represent the interest of common Frenchmen. So the National Assembly was supposed to represent the interest of common Frenchmen, anyone who would have been the third in the third estate. It's supposed to represent the interest of the middle and lower classes. Now, at the same time that all this was going on within the Estates General, the peasants were in full revolt. So you have members of the middle class revolting against the Estates General and saying, we're going to form the National Assembly and we're going to form our own little government here because we don't like the way that all this is working. The peasants were also in full revolt. On July 14th, 1789, they stormed the Parisian prison known as the Bastille. And they were successful. The success of this riot inspired more peasants to clamor for representation. Peasants wanted to be represented. They wanted to not be the ones forced to pay all the taxes for the country. And so more peasants joined on to this bandwagon. They wanted to be a part of this revolt and try to reform the government. And the diversion that it caused kept the government from dealing with the National Assembly. So middle-class citizens banded together, who would have been from the Third Estate, to form the National Assembly. Peasants, who also would have been from the Third Estate, went into full revolt and actually attacked a Parisian prison, and since they were successful, this inspired more peasants to join the revolt, and it diverted the government's attention, so they didn't try to deal with the National Assembly right away, and that gave them a longer chance to gain a foothold. After the storming of the Bastille and the formation of the National Assembly in 1789, the French middle and lower classes, who would have both been part of the Third Estate of the Estates General, they joined together and established a new government with the slogan, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. So this was still a form of the National Assembly, but now it included the lower classes as well. The peasants and the lower class citizens joined with those middle class citizens who originally started the National Assembly, and they came up with their own government whose slogan was Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. This government quickly reformed the tax code. They wanted it to be fair for everybody, and they declared that government offices would be filled based on merit only from then on. So instead of government offices being given based on if you were friends with people in politics or based on if they were paying money for that office, that wouldn't happen anymore. Now the people filling the government offices were going to be people who were qualified for the job and were only getting the job based on their merit and not on how much money or land they could pay to the government to have that position. The National Assembly also eliminated serfdom, which was when people would have to work for lords of a manor. So if you had people working for a lord and they didn't actually own any land of their own, they would be considered serfs, and they would be made to work that land in exchange for protection from the lord of that manor. Now, they didn't actually have any land for themselves, and they were required to work that land. There wasn't another option for them. So the National Assembly eliminated that, saying these people were free to go where they wanted. They didn't have to work that land anymore. And they also drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was similar to the American Bill of Rights. It was basically just a list of the rights that every man was born with. These are natural rights that people are born with and that everyone should get. And so the Declaration of the Rights of Man just basically declared what the rights were that every man was entitled to just based on being alive in France. The National Assembly then seized the lands that belonged to the church. So the clergy, who had been one of their somewhat enemies in the Estates General, they seized the land that belonged to the church, a lot of which had been gained with the church saying, okay, we'll give you a position in the church office, or we'll sell you or we'll knock some time off your time in purgatory, or let you go straight to heaven if you pay us money or you give us some land. So a lot of that land had come to the church through some shady ways. So now the National Assembly just seized that land for its new government, and it eliminated the feudal rights of the aristocracy. So the nobles were your aristocracy. They were the ones who were the lords who had these serfs working for them. And so if you take away their serfs and you tell them the feudalism policy isn't going to be in place anymore, you basically taken away their power. You took away the land from the church, and that took away a lot of power from them. So this all was going to make the National Assembly a little bit stronger and give them an actual voice against the rest of the Estates General. However, there was soon dissension within the Third Estate, which was what the National Assembly was made up of, and the revolution became more radical and violent. So you had problems in the Estates General. The first two estates, the nobles and the clergy, ganged up against the Third Estate, made up of the middle and lower classes, and would always outvote them, made them pay all the taxes, and they just weren't listened to. So the Third Estate broke off, formed the National Assembly, peasants joined in, they made their own government, but eventually the National Assembly, which was made up of the Third Estate, began to have dissension within itself, which was going to weaken them, and this revolution just became more radical and more violent after this point. The French Revolution, Robespierre. As the government established by the Third Estate, which was the group in the Estates General made up of the peasants and middle-class citizens. The government they created was known as the National Assembly, and it was in response to their voice not being heard in the Estates General. So once they established their government, they quickly started fighting amongst themselves. The middle-class citizens would be fighting with the peasants, and eventually that government descended into chaos, at which point the radical Jacobin leader, Maximilien Robespierre, took charge. Robespierre had an idealistic vision of what France would become, and he was willing to kill thousands in order to see it realized. Anybody that got in his way could fall victim to execution. The guillotine became very popular at this time, and it provided a swift way to execute many opponents. A group that included anyone who challenged the Jacobin party line, or anyone who was suspected of retaining their Catholic faith in the new culture of state-mandated atheism. So Robespierre's vision did not include there being a big religious factor, and so in his new culture, the state was, or the country was going to be an atheistic one, and he was going to try to kill anybody who was trying to keep their Catholic faith openly. And since there was a really strong Catholic group in France at the time, and before Robespierre took over, the clergy had a large voice in politics. There were a lot of people who probably were trying to retain their Catholic faith, and so that was going to be a big problem for Robespierre, as well as anyone who was challenging the Jacobin party line or challenging Robespierre himself. So there were many people executed during this time, and among those executed were King Charles XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. And King Charles XVI had actually tried to make things a little fairer for the Third Estate, who was having to pay all of the taxes, while the First and Second Estates of the Estates General weren't required to pay taxes. So he had tried to do something nice before the Third Estate made its own government and then fell into chaos, and then Robespierre took over. And he executed King Charles and his wife, so then he didn't have another government figure in his way. But after a while, the French grew tired of the violence and turmoil of the Reign of Terror, which is what Robespierre's reign ended up being called. And Robespierre himself fell victim to the guillotine. So after a while, the French grew tired of the violence. They were seeing way too many people killed for things that they didn't necessarily disagree with. And so if they were saying, okay, we agree with what you're challenging the Jacobin party line on, or we also want to practice our Catholic faith, those people weren't going to be happy to see people who shared their views being killed. And the turmoil of this reign, with Robespierre and his political party all looking out for who was challenging them and who was doing what they weren't supposed to, they weren't really actually following through on giving France that idealistic culture that Robespierre had envisioned. And so there was a lot of turmoil instead of it being a time for growth and prosperity. So after Robespierre was executed via guillotine, a group of 5 prominent men known as the Directory was established to restore calm. So they took over ruling France after Robespierre's death. And this group would last until 1799, when it was overthrown in a coup that would eventually bring Napoleon Bonaparte to power. But just to give you an idea of the steps in the French Revolution, we went from having the Estates General pretty much getting along to the Third Estate being outvoted every time by the First and Second Estates. So the Third Estate could never get what it wanted for its group members, the lower and middle classes, and also they were paying all the taxes while the First and Second Estates were not required to pay taxes. Once the Third Estate broke off and formed its own government, it made some positive changes, but then the members of the Third Estate quickly started fighting amongst themselves. That descended into chaos. Robespierre took over. And with his reign of terror, there was a lot of violence and turmoil, and France still had to rebuild from that after Robespierre's death. The French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, who lived from 1769 to 1821, began his career as a French military commander. Scoring major victories in Austria and England. So he was a military commander who showed great skill because he was able to win some major victories in other countries before he returned to France. Upon his return to the chaos of France, Napoleon led a coup against the current French government and was installed as the leader of France. He was soon elected by popular vote as well. So while Napoleon did lead a coup and take over the French government before he was installed as the leader, he also, after he installed himself as the leader, gave people a chance to vote, and he was elected by popular vote to be the leader of France as well. So he had taken over it without anyone's permission, leading a coup or small revolt to take over the government. But then he was voted to be elected as their leader as well. So he did get the popular vote as well as taking it without asking. Almost immediately, Napoleon reformed French education, agriculture, and infrastructure. And this may be why people were happy to vote for him, why he was able to win the popular vote. Because trying to improve education, agriculture, and the infrastructure of their society was going to be improving things for the people of France. And so they were going to be happy about that and say, oh yeah, we like this guy, let's keep him there. But the main goal of Napoleon's rule was acquisition of territory both in Europe and the New World, so the Americas. So while Napoleon did want to make things better at home in France, he also wanted to expand France's territory and acquire land in Europe from other countries, make them part of France, as well as colonize and claim land over in the New World. His troops quickly conquered Austria, Portugal, Spain, and Prussia, so he did take over some other parts of Europe and make them a part of France. Napoleon, who modeled himself after Charlemagne in many ways, then crowned himself emperor. So once Napoleon had conquered these 4 previous countries, he named himself Emperor of France, and so he was emperor of all of these lands. But the French Empire proved too large to manage, however, as tends to happen when someone conquers too much land, they can't control all of it, and so either they try to split up power or things just start to fall apart. And so the French Empire proved too large for Napoleon, but he still tried to gain more land, and he further weakened himself with a disastrous campaign against Russia. Now, Russia was another large country. He'd conquered some smaller countries, but then he led a campaign against Russia, which was a very big country, and he lost. So after Napoleon's debacle in Russia debilitated his military, so France was already having trouble maintaining its empire status because it had grown so large, but Napoleon still led another campaign into a big country and tried to take over there. He failed, and after this, his military was debilitated. It was broken. He didn't have nearly as many soldiers as he had before because a lot of them had died during that campaign, and some for sure had died during these campaigns. So he'd really shrunk down the size of his military, and he already had things kind of falling apart politically. So after Russia, revolts started springing up in many of the nations that he had conquered, and Napoleon was overthrown and exiled. So revolts started springing up in all of these countries that he had conquered before: Austria, Portugal, Spain, Prussia. I'm sure some of the people in Russia also had something out for him because Napoleon had tried to invade Russia. But several of these countries had revolts rise up and say, we're not going to be part of France anymore, especially after they saw that Napoleon was able to be defeated. So the leaders of the countries that had overthrown Napoleon and exiled him, so they didn't kill him. There had been a lot of violence from other leaders in this time, but they did not kill Napoleon. They said, okay, we're going to exile you. So they sent him to this island called Elba out in the Mediterranean Sea, and they said, okay, you're exiled to this island until we figure out what to do with you. So the leaders of the countries that had overthrown Napoleon met in Vienna to decide how to respond to him. What should they do with him now? They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to figure out something else to do with him. However, these 3 men were in constant disagreement. So there were 3 men that were basically in charge at this meeting in Vienna, but they couldn't agree on anything. And since they were in constant disagreement, that was kind of the distraction Napoleon needed, and he used that opportunity to return from his exile on Elba and reclaim power. So he didn't stay in exile. He said, okay, I'm escaping from my exile, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to take back my power, at least in France. He may not have been able to get to all the other countries who had revolted against him, but he could go back to France and claim some of his power back. But finally, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo and sent into permanent exile. So he did get out of exile, come back, make a small comeback as the leader of France, but then these leaders said, okay, that's enough. We already exiled you once. So then they took him and they put him into permanent exile, and that was his punishment that they decided. They still didn't kill him, but they said, okay, instead of being exiled for a certain amount of time, now you are exiled permanently. And the Allies met again at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where France wasn't treated too harshly. So they were still pretty fair. This group of leaders who came together in Vienna was pretty fair. They didn't kill Napoleon. Even after he escaped exile and tried to reclaim power again, they said, okay, we're still not going to kill you. You're going to go into permanent exile. And then, whenever they were trying to decide how to sort everything out, France was not treated too harshly. They didn't say, oh, since Napoleon was in charge of you, we're going to take as much land as we can from you, France. They were pretty fair with France. And it was determined that a balance of power should be maintained in Europe to ensure that no one in the future tried to dominate the continent. So you had several people that would gain power in their own country and then try to expand and take over the countries around them. And sometimes they would call it an empire, and sometimes they would just say this is all one country and not actually call themselves an emperor. But they try to take over the surrounding countries. And so this group said we need to maintain a balance of power. So no one leader is going to take over a country and then say, oh, let me take over the countries around us. Let me try to take over all of Europe. So that's what they were trying to do here, was to make sure that no one country or no one leader in a country tried to dominate the whole continent and take over its surrounding neighbor nations during trying to have a goal of expansion. So from now on, any expanding that was going to be done would have to be done in the New World. So Napoleon was a strong leader in France. He did make some good reforms, but because his primary goal was expansion both in Europe and in the New World, he didn't get as far as he could have with France itself. And he did have several successful campaigns where he did gain more land for France, enough to call it an empire and call himself the emperor. But after his loss in Russia, he quickly lost the other countries he'd gained to a series of revolts against him. He was exiled, came back from his exile, and reclaimed some power briefly, but then went into permanent exile. And after this, after Napoleon's attempt to make an emperor out of all of Europe, the European nations decided to try to maintain a balance of power so that no one nation would try to dominate the whole continent. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 19th century produced immediate and far-reaching changes in the social structure. New energy sources, such as the steam engine, made great increases in productivity possible. So there were several different new energy sources. They found new ways to use water power. They found such as with the steam engine, that's harnessing water as steam. They also found new ways to use coal, new ways to practice metallurgy. There was a lot of new ways to use energy that they'd previously used, or newfound sources of energy. And all of those things combined to increase productivity. The factory system for manufacturing textiles was implemented, meaning that individuals were only required to do one in a series of tasks required to prepare a piece of cloth. So each person would know how to do one job, or a couple people would know how to do one job, and then they'd do their one part and pass it off to the next step. And at the next step, a couple of people would know how to do that job, and so no one had to know how to make the whole piece or whole bolt of cloth. They only had to know how to do a certain part of it. And so this division of labor also increased productivity. Before, one person would do all the jobs, and they may be really good at one part but really bad at another part, or they may be really quick at one part but really slow at another part. So this let people work where their strengths could shine and where their strengths would get the most use. So someone who was really fast at the first step of the process could work there, someone who was really fast at the last step could work there, and all the spots in the middle. So everyone was trained to do just one in a series of tasks instead of one person having to do all the tasks. And that made things go quicker and increased productivity. So with the success of the textile industry and new energy resources, more and more workers were needed in European cities. So before, there were people in cities, but there were also a lot of people that lived out in the country on farms or had their own homes on a piece of land where they grew their own food. And there were people that flocked to the cities for art or learning, but they didn't really come there for work as much. Only the merchants could really get a job coming from the farmlands into the city. But now people began to abandon their country lives and take factory jobs in town, in different cities across Europe. Now, industrialization did come to England before it came anywhere else, but it quickly spread throughout Europe and then just a little while later over to America. So once it started, it spread quickly, but it did begin in England. Now, people left their country lives to go work in these factories because now there was a new job there. There was something they could go and have a possible better life than they did on their farms. And this rapid urbanization, which is when urban areas grow quickly, such as the areas within a city or surrounding a city, this rapid urbanization created a new middle class in Europe. So let's look at some of the pros to the urbanization and how that middle class developed. As people flooded the cities to work in booming factories, large landowners consolidated the farmlands they left behind. So people would flood to the cities to work, and they would sell off their farms so that they could make that move and have somewhere to live and a little bit of money to live on while they got set up in their new job. Large landowners would say, okay, we'll stay here and just keep taking all the land, we'll buy it off of them as they leave, and we'll have lots and lots of land, and we can do with it whatever we want to make the most money. So this was a good thing for the large landowners because they were going to be able to have more land. And it did give the people who were flocking to the cities a way to get a little money to start them off, but they were giving up the place that they had lived and had a home and had at least food to eat. Now, they may not have been able to make as much money. If they had just a small area to plant, they may have only been able to make enough food for themselves and not enough to make money. So moving into the cities gave them an opportunity to possibly be able to make more money and become wealthier as a family. The booming success of industry made many people rich as investors and merchants, and the middle class gained even more political power in Europe. So where the middle class didn't have as much political power because they weren't as wealthy as the upper class citizens, now the middle class was becoming richer and it was gaining more political power. Social mobility was much more possible in this economic environment, encouraging many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not especially lucrative. Well, social mobility is the idea that you can move from one class to another. So a lower class citizen who may have been virtually a peasant out on the farms may have moved in, got a factory job, people saw that he did a good job and he gets promoted and he makes way more money that way and can actually move up into the lower class and then move into the middle class and maybe even higher. But instead of being trapped in the class that you were born in, there's a lot more mobility. You could sell your farm that had made you plenty of money in hopes of going and investing in a factory in the city and your factory could fail. So you could drop from middle class or upper middle class to lower class very quickly, or you could go as a peasant or a lower class farmer and do well in one of the factories or become a supervisor there, and you could end up making more money and rise from being lower class up to middle class or higher. So there was a lot more mobility here as far as social class goes, and the reason that I encouraged many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative was that they had the opportunity to advance. So they may say, okay, well, I'm going to take this factory job. It's not paying me very much money. It's not paying me as much as I could have made on my farm. But if I do a good job, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can save up enough money to be able to invest in something. Maybe I can start my own factory someday. So people had ambition, and they envisioned having more opportunity here rather than opportunities out on the farms. There wasn't as much available for them to move social class-wise out there, where in the cities there was always that possibility. This rapid urbanization also created a number of problems. So many people moving to the city at once would create some problems. First of all, most cities did not have the infrastructure to support a large population explosion. So they didn't have the streets, first of all, but they also didn't have any of the city services in place for such a large population. They were used to maintaining who they had in the city, that level of a population that was slowly growing. They weren't used to having so many people come all at once. So they didn't have the housing, they didn't have sewer, they didn't have running water, they didn't have enough of anything really to take care of all these people. And the roadways, of course, weren't going to be used or used to having that much traffic on them, both foot traffic and different carts and different apparatuses that people are using to move all their stuff from the farm to the city. There's going to be a lot more traffic, and there's going to be a lot more people. And the cities weren't prepared for that internally whenever all these people came. And as a result, disease, crime, and poverty were common. So you could end up moving from the lower class up to the middle class, but you could drop down from the middle class to the lower class, or you could just stay in the lower class if that's where you were. If you come in, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have somewhere to stay, you can't stay in an inn, you don't have the money for it, you can't buy your own home. There's a lot that you don't have access to in the city without money. And so poverty was common. Crime was common. If you didn't have money and you couldn't get a factory job, or you weren't making enough of the factory job and your family still needed to eat, then you may steal from someone to be able to make ends meet. And so crime was common. And then disease. With so many people living so closely together, if one person got sick, it was going to spread very quickly, and so disease was common. So there were some negatives to this rapid urbanization. And working class individuals. Now, we talked about how they had the possibility to move up, but we also talked about how they may stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative. So some working class individuals were probably not pleased with their new lives. They had 18-hour days sometimes, many times. They had low wages. The factory owners knew all these people wanted to work in factories, so they didn't have to pay them that much. They just had to pay them enough that they could get workers in the door. And if people were waiting in line to work there, you didn't have to pay them that much more. You could just pay them the bare minimum that they would come to work for. And dangerous machinery. These factories had people working in there, but they were also full of dangerous machines, and so that was something that you had to worry about on a daily basis if you are working in a factory. And they also, you have to think about who was working. Women and children also worked. So the men were going into these dangerous machinery-filled factories and working these 18-hour days for low wages, but women and children were doing the same thing, and they were often paid less than men. And they were also usually given the most menial jobs. So if they thought the men could lift stuff and they could figure stuff out better, then they would be given better jobs. The women and children may have been given jobs that were more along the lines of cleaning up after people, sweeping, washing dishes, sewing. They weren't going to be given the better jobs. They were going to be given worse jobs, harder jobs sometimes, and they were going to be paid less than men. So they're working in these same dangerous conditions a lot of the time, but being paid less. So while there were some benefits to people moving very quickly to the city, there were also some drawbacks as well. A small rebellion led by a group called the Luddites tried to resist industrialization and were known for vandalizing factory equipment. So they were one group who did not like this industrialization. They didn't like all the bad things they saw come with it, and they didn't like the social class changing, and they said, okay, we don't want all this industrialization. We want things to kind of stay how they were, but that didn't really work out. For the most part, people were optimistic about the prospect of upward mobility. They thought they might be able to move from a lower social class to a higher one. And they were willing to endure hardship for hope. So even though they were working these bad jobs for low pay, they had that hope, that option that they could advance, that they could make more money, that they could have better lives here in the city. So the Industrial Revolution was just whenever, all at once in the 19th century, very quickly energy sources came along that were new to people and increased productivity. And one of the big things was that the factory system came about, where each person would work on one step in the process and it would get things done quicker. That division of labor increased productivity. And with all of this, with the factory system, there was a rapid increase of population to cities throughout Europe.
An important feature of our constitutional form of government is the separation of powers. The separation of powers means that our government, our national government, has three branches. Those three branches are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch, according to our Constitution, is charged with making the law. Our executive branch has the power to enforce the law. And our judicial branch has the constitutional power to interpret the law or say what the law means. Now, to ensure that no one branch becomes more powerful than the other branches, the Constitution also has a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances and separation of powers are in our U.S. Constitution. So when we look at the separation of powers and the checks and balances, we see that the most important power that the legislative branch or the U.S. Congress has is the power to make law. Now, the Constitution limits the types of powers or the types of laws that Congress can make. For example, when you look at Article 1, Section 8, there's a phrase in that part of the Constitution that states legislative powers herein granted, and there are a listing of specific powers that Congress can legislate. For example, Congress can have the power, does have the power of taxation. On the other hand, in the next section, Article 1, Section 9, there are some prohibited areas that the Congress or the legislative branch cannot legislate in or make law. For example, the Congress cannot release any money from the Treasury unless it's done by appropriation. That is, unless Congress does a budget and that budget passes Congress with the approval of the President or the executive branch. Now that brings us back to this idea of checks and balances. Again, the most important power that Congress has is the power to make law. To make sure that Congress does not become more powerful than the executive or the judicial branch in its power to make law, for example, the executive branch can veto legislation passed by Congress. And a check and a balance that the legislative branch has on the executive branch's power to veto, to ensure that the executive branch doesn't become so powerful that everything that the legislative branch passes is overruled by veto. The legislative branch can override the executive branch's veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. When we look at how this checks and balance relationship relates to the judicial branch, again, very important power that Congress has, and that power is to make law. Now, the judicial branch can check the legislative branch's power to make law through this power called judicial review. And judicial review is exercised by the judicial branch and exercising its power to interpret the law. When the judicial branch uses this check on the legislative branch, which is called the judicial review, the judicial branch can rule actions, that is, laws passed by Congress, as unconstitutional. However, the legislative branch does have a check on the judicial branch's use of judicial review. The legislative branch can amend the Constitution, and that is a check that the legislative branch has on the judicial branch. Checks and balances also works in relationship between the executive branch and the judicial branch. For example, we know that the executive branch has the power to enforce the law. Again, with the power or the use of judicial review, use of judicial review, the judicial branch can rule actions conducted in the process of enforcing the law. The judicial branch, with judicial review, can rule actions by the executive branch as unconstitutional. Also, with this system of checks and balances, the executive branch has a check on the power of the judicial branch. Whenever there is a vacancy in the judicial branch, the executive branch, that is the president, will nominate someone to fill that judicial vacancy. So the executive branch plays a role in determining who actually sits on various federal courts and the Supreme Court of the United States. So, with separation of powers and checks and balances, our Constitution ensures that no single branch will become too powerful, and that the system of checks and balances also ensures that each branch will be able to function, and in turn will have the branches working together for the advancement of the liberty of all the people in the United States. A fundamental belief held by founding fathers was that our basic individual liberties originated from God or came from God. This is one reason the Bill of Rights is part of our U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is composed of the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, the Bill of Rights was part of a compromise between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Federalist approved of ratifying the U.S. Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists were opposed. One reason the Anti-Federalists opposed ratifying or approving the U.S. Constitution among the states was because the U.S. Constitution, as drafted out of the 1787 Convention in Philadelphia, did not have a listing of rights as the state constitutions had and still have today. The Anti-Federalists stated, how can you have a constitution which bounds or restricts government but not have rights listed that government should guarantee or protect? So what the Federalists promised or compromised is that if some Anti-Federalists would agree to ratify the U.S. Constitution, one of the first acts of Congress would be to ratify a listing of rights, or the Bill of Rights, to the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights were ratified in December 15, 1791. Now let's look at these amendments, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment lists 5 basic freedoms: the freedom of religion, speech, press, peaceable assembly, and government petition. With the freedom of religion, it's the idea that the people would be able to worship as their heart and as they see fit, and there would not be any government-sponsored church. Freedom of speech and press gives individuals the right to express their beliefs and feelings about government, even if those beliefs are contrary or against the government. And the reason we're able to have a free press, that is, newspapers today, televisions, radio, is because of the First Amendment protects the right of the people to express their beliefs. Then you have freedom of peaceable assembly, the idea that the people collectively can come together and protest their government, and government petition. Petition meaning to ask or demand from their government. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, or the right of the people to own firearms for their individual protection and, if need be, to prevent government tyranny. We would say the first 5 freedoms listed in the Bill of Rights mean nothing without the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment provides a protection of the people from the quartering of soldiers in private homes except by law during wartime. Before the American Revolution, during the French and Indian War, the American colonists were forced by the British government, and even after the French and Indian War, they were forced into quartering or housing soldiers in their private homes without a law. It was just a military edict. The Third Amendment protects the people from that type of abuse. Then you have the Fourth Amendment, which is a protection from unreasonable search and seizure. The idea that people can find peace and privacy in their person and among their papers and in their homes. The Fifth Amendment provides for due process and protection from double jeopardy and self-incrimination. Due process, that if someone is charged with a crime, there is a process, a rule of law, in order to find that person either guilty or innocent. Protection against double jeopardy. You cannot be found guilty for the same crime multiple times. And self-incrimination. The government cannot force you to take the testimony stand and testify against yourself. The Sixth Amendment, the right of the accused to a speedy public trial before an impartial jury. The idea is that if you're accused of a crime, the trial will be speedy, quick as possible, and it will be a public trial. You will not be allowed to languish in jail. And the trial will be public, where people can see that, again, going back to Amendment 5, that due process is being adhered to. And then the case is laid out before an impartial jury, a jury that is just going to look at the merits of the case and decide either guilty or not guilty. The Seventh Amendment protects the right of the people to a civil trial by jury in accordance with common law. Now, civil law or a civil trial is different from a criminal trial. In a civil trial, we're dealing with disagreements between individuals or different groups of people. A criminal trial is a crime, a harm. It's a trial that attempts to right a crime or a harm done against someone else, such as murder, theft, or burglary. A civil trial is a disagreement, maybe a business disagreement, between two individuals concerning a contract. Well, the Seventh Amendment protects the right of the people that if you seek redress in a civil court, you have a right to a trial. And that trial by jury is conducted in accordance with common law. Then we have the Eighth Amendment. The idea is that the people are protected from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive fines and bail. This is pretty self-explanatory. The Eighth Amendment protects the people from the government imposing very cruel and unreasonable punishments on the people. The punishment should fit the crime. Amendment 9 preserves rights not mentioned. In other words, any right not mentioned in the Bill of Rights is automatically preserved and reserved to individuals. And then the 10th Amendment is a preservation of the rights of states and individuals. The idea that any powers that are not given to the national government in the Constitution, or any rights not given to the national government in the Constitution, are automatically reserved to the states and the individuals respectively.
Microeconomics and macroeconomics. Economics studies, in general, how resources are allocated. But let's look at what the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics really is. Microeconomics focuses on economic factors such as the way consumers behave, how income is distributed, and output and input markets. But the most important thing to remember to differentiate between microeconomics and macroeconomics is that microeconomics studies are limited to the industry or firm level. So we're looking at how the consumers behave toward a specific industry or toward a specific product, toward a specific company, how income is distributed for that specific company or for companies within a specific industry, the output and input markets for those specific industries or for a specific company. The factors considered help determine production decisions of individual firms or companies based on their resources and the cost that they would have to put in to be able to make a profit. So microeconomics is just focusing on specific industries or on specific companies. Macroeconomics examines economies on a much larger scale than microeconomics. And here's the important thing to remember to differentiate with macroeconomics. Studies look at economic trends and structures on a national level. So it's not just looking at one industry or one company. It's looking at the whole country to see how that whole country's economy is faring. What trends do they see? What structures? What's the market like in that country? Not just necessarily in a specific industry or for a specific firm or company. So, to remember that, macro is much larger, so it's a national level. Micro is smaller, so it's on the industry or firm level. So those are the important things to remember to differentiate here. Now, with macroeconomics, there are some different variables that are looked at and studied to look for these trends for a whole nation's economy. They look at output of the whole nation, consumption of the whole nation. So what are they putting out and what are they actually consuming? All the industries, all the consumers, what are all the producers able to put out? What are all the industries able to put out? And what are the consumers actually consuming? How much is actually being purchased and used? Investment, government spending. How much is the government having to spend to keep markets stabilized? Or are they spending too much and making the markets inflated? And then net exports. How much are we actually producing that we get to ship out of the country and make an external profit on? We're not just making a profit off of people that live in our country, but we're making a profit, and that's money coming in from the outside. So we're not looking at very specific things for one industry or company. We're looking at everything as a whole for the whole nation with macroeconomics. And the overall economic condition of a nation is defined as the gross domestic product. Or the GDP. And the GDP measures a nation's economic output over a limited time period, such as a year. So it would say how much the nation was able to put out over what it was actually taking in. What's the gross domestic product that we were able to produce? So, important things to remember, economics is always going to be studying how our resources are allocated, how people are buying things, how people are selling things, how things are balancing out or not balancing out. But microeconomics is going to focus on a specific industry or firm or company, where macroeconomics is going to focus on the economy of a nation as a whole. Market failure. Certain elements are necessary to create what economists refer to as perfect competition. When you have perfect competition, it means there are plenty of suppliers providing a variety of products to meet the demands of buyers or consumers. If one of these factors is weak or lacking, the market is classified as having imperfect competition. So, the factors aren't missing necessarily, they're just weak or lacking. They're not as strong as they should be. They don't have the same weight as in a perfect competition market. Now, when any of these factors or elements is missing, market failure can occur. It doesn't mean it will every time. It just makes it much more likely that market failure will occur if one of the important elements is missing. And there are 5 major types of market failure that describe what would be missing, what crucial element would be missing in order to cause that market failure and keep it from being imperfect competition or, at the best, perfect competition. So, one reason you might have market failure is that competition is inadequate. There aren't enough suppliers providing competition for the buyers. If there's only one supplier and they're putting the cost too high, buyers aren't going to buy it unless it's something they absolutely need. If there is only one company providing a good, but they're not making something that buyers want, then that's also going to be a problem. So if there's adequate competition, there are going to be a variety of products available at a variety of prices. If competition is inadequate, that will not be true, and it can lead to market failure. None of these things is a definite will lead to market failure. Just with economists analyzing why markets fail, these are some of the main reasons that markets have failed. Next, we have information is inadequate. A good example of that is with cigarettes. If the cigarette companies didn't tell people that smoking was bad, it could lead to lung cancer, it had lots of chemicals in it that were unhealthy for you, then whenever people found out that that information was inadequate, then they're going to stop buying it. And on the same page, people that didn't know smoking was bad would be buying the cigarettes even though they didn't have that information. So once the information came out, there would be a sharp drop in sales where there was an inaccurate rise in sales before people knew all of the information. So if all of the information isn't given about a product, then people may buy it ignorantly, not knowing that it's bad for them, or if people give information that is incorrect, then people may buy it not knowing that what they've been told is not actually true. So having adequate information is going to keep you in a good market situation, but inadequate information can lead to market failure. Next, we have resources are not mobile. If you're a supplier and you have resources, but you can't get them to the places they need to be, then you're not going to be making any money off of those resources. Some good examples are land. There are some places that need land, but you can't just transport land. For instance, England could use land because they're just on an island. But and the United States has lots of open land, but you can't just take out a chunk of Wyoming and put it over on England and say, here, you've got land. That resource is not mobile. Another resource that could be mobile, but a lot of times isn't, is people. Your labor forces. If you've got people that are willing to work for you here, but they're not willing to travel and work for you in another place, that resource of human labor is not mobile. So having resources that are mobile, if you're selling goods and products that can be shipped, then that's going to be a good thing. If you've got resources that you can't really move around, it's not so good. So if you're trying to sell real estate, it's got to stay in that one space. You can't sell it and have it move somewhere else. You can't move land to a different place, and a lot of times you can't move a whole house to different places. Some houses you can, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. So resources that are not mobile can lead to market failure. Another element that could lead to market failure is negative externalities. So these are side effects of a market that affect third parties. Now, externalities can be positive or negative. Positive externalities are not going to usually lead to market failure, where negative externalities can. Examples of negative externalities would be pollution. If in the process of manufacturing goods you are producing a lot of air pollution, people aren't going to be happy about that, and the environmentalists that complain about it can lead to market failure for whatever market was polluting the air without any proper precautions. Another example would be traffic. People buying new cars are going to be congesting areas with traffic. And so lots and lots of cars on these highways are going to have traffic. It's going to cause traffic jams at certain times of the day or certain days of the week. And so traffic can be a negative externality. Yes, the car market is good. People need to buy cars. People need to get to work. But whenever more and more people buy their own vehicles instead of carpooling or using public transit, those cars are going to all end up contributing to traffic congestion, which would be classified as a negative externality and can lead to market failure. And lastly, we have failure to provide public goods. If you don't provide something the public wants or needs, then you're not going to have a very good market. People will have to actually want or need your product in order to go out and buy it. So if you're not providing something people actually want or need, then that could lead to market failure. So market failure is not always inevitable. You've got perfect competition whenever all the elements you need are there. If one of those elements is weak, then you would have imperfect competition. And if one of those elements is missing, you could still have imperfect competition. But a lot of times, if you are missing one of the crucial elements for a perfect competition market, then you're going to end up eventually heading into market failure. And these 5 major elements that could contribute to market failure can contribute to market failure, but it will not always lead to market failure. If your business or a business is experiencing one of these crucial elements that can lead to market failure, they will need to correct it, or they most likely will experience a market failure. Marketing plan. Before you can successfully create and sell a product, you should decide on your marketing plan. Also known as the 4 P's. First, you need to decide on your product. And this is really anything relating directly to the product. This is including packaging, presentation, or services included along with the product. Anything that a customer or consumer might want to know about the product, you should have an answer to their question. You should know that information before they ask for it. So anything that might need to be known about the product, you need to know about, and it needs to be included in the packaging, presentation, and extra services included along with it, or within the actual product. So product is the product itself plus everything that goes with it. Next, we have to figure out the price. And price is going to calculate the cost of production, distribution, advertising, etc. So the cost of actually making the product, advertising for it, distributing for it, how much money the producer is going to have to put out in making and getting this product to where it can be sold, as well as the desired profit. So how much does the producer want to make from selling this product? And they use this information to determine what to charge for the product. Now, if you charge too much, people aren't going to buy it. If you charge Too little, you may not make the profit that you wanted. So you may have to tweak the formula a little, or adjust how much you want to make in profit, or adjust what you're going to charge to figure out the final price and get it to where you're making what you want to make as far as a profit is concerned, but you are also not charging so much that people aren't buying your product. Next, our next P, you have to figure out place. Now, this has changed a lot in the last few years. What outlets will be used to sell the product? Traditional outlets such as stores and actual buildings where you can walk in and buy something. Direct mail, where people are going to send you something and you order it through the mail, order it through a catalog. Internet marketing, where you just order right offline, etc. You've got door-to-door sales, you've got people selling stuff outside of stores. So there are lots of different venues, but especially the internet marketing has grown rapidly over the last several years. So there are lots of different outlets to consider whenever you're considering the place. If you're investing in actual buildings, you're going to have to think about the overhead of selling your products out of that store. Where with internet, you only have to pay for a warehouse and then you ship your things from there. So you kind of have to balance that out. So place can refer to actual places where people can walk into, or it can refer to outlets such as the mail or internet marketing. But basically, the place refers to the market in which your product will be sold. And our last P is promotion. How are you going to get the word out about your product? So this is ways to let consumers, your possible customers, know the product is available through advertising and other means. So you want to let them know it's available. You want to let them know why they need this product, why it would be useful to them. Promotion is basically that, promoting your product so people will want to either go out and buy it, or get online and buy it, or send off so that it comes in the mail for them. Now, once these elements have been established, the producer can start producing and distributing the product. Now, you could try to do this without actually thinking about all of this, but without a marketing plan, it's less likely that your product is going to sell successfully. So, if you are thinking about a new product, keep in mind that a marketing plan is very beneficial, and you will have to know the product, price, place, and promotion.
The social structure of a society can be defined by any characteristic of that society. So social structure is not concerned with the individuals of a society. It's concerned with a society as a whole. So the social structure of a society is defined by any characteristic of that society, as distinguished from characteristics of the individuals that compose the society. So in other words, the social structure is not determined by the people in a society. It's not concerned with people. It's concerned with the society as a whole. Specifically, it's concerned with the systems in which they interact with each other and with the values of the society. So it's looking at the people as a whole, particularly the systems in which they interact and their values. Now, sociologists divide social structures into 4 categories. So we have them here on the board: normative, ideal, interest, and interaction. So all of these social structures basically are relationships between people and something else. Fill in the blank. So we have the normative social structures, which are relationships between people and social norms. And then ideal, which is relationships between people and society's belief system. So you have a certain belief system that goes along with that society, and so ideal is the relationship between people and that belief system. Then we have interest, relationship between people and their desires. And finally, we have interaction, which is the relationship just between people. So between people and the other people in that society. So those are the four categories that sociologists divide social structures into. And so sociologists study these relationships in an attempt to discover how people of different classes relate to social structures, as well as to determine how the structures themselves contribute to the quality of life. Socialization is the process through which individuals born into a society gradually become participating members of that society. So socialization can be split up into two parts. Part one is learning the culture. Culture is a very broad term, but essentially it's the comprehensive style of living that is developed in a society and maintained from generation to generation. And so two big parts of culture are the prevailing social values. In other words, what is considered important in that culture, and the cultural norms. Cultural norms could be as simple as just how to greet someone within that culture. The second part of socialization is learning to assume the behavior appropriate to a specific societal role. So this looks different for different people even within the same culture because people occupy different roles. So this role could be associated with someone's age, their relationship to other people, or their occupation, or a number of other things. And then sociologists split socialization up into primary and secondary socialization. So primary socialization is the period in which an infant acquires the rudiments of language. So the family plays a huge role within primary socialization. In fact, that is almost the only social institution that helps an infant acquire language because the child spends very little time outside of the home. And so primary socialization is them understanding language. And then secondary socialization goes beyond that. It's as the individual is trained to join a particular group. And so this particular group can be the culture, but then also maybe a particular role or societal institution they're entering into. And primary socialization definitely has a beginning point and an end point to it. Secondary socialization has a beginning point, but it really doesn't have an ending point because most sociologists concur that socialization continues in some degree throughout an individual's entire life, though it's most crucial in childhood. Most people's habits and their understanding of culture and the way they speak is going to be formed in childhood. So the family plays a huge role in primary socialization as well as secondary socialization. So that's a look at socialization. Social classes are the ranks of people in a society according to status. And this status can come from their family, personal wealth, education, or other achievements. Before Karl Marx, most social commentators outline class in terms of power and wealth already attained by a certain group. Marx, however, suggested that true power, and therefore higher class, belongs to those who control the means to create more wealth, and thus remain at the top of the social stratification. Now, social class takes on a concrete form in some cultures, such as in India's caste system, in which social position is rigidly determined by birth. But in other cultures or countries, such as the United States, there are more fluid ideas of class in which citizens can move up or down depending on their successes or failures. And so, in places where there's a more rigidly defined social class system, family is very important to one's social class because many times you are born into a certain social class. But even in cultures like the United States, family is still important because many times they confer personal wealth upon their children or they provide the means to get a good education. Now, Karl Marx defined three different types of social classes. So the first is the upper class, which is the bourgeoisie. So this is the highest class, and they own the means of production. And so since they own the means of production, they receive the benefit of the labor of the lower classes. And so Marx believed that the bourgeoisie were originally a creative class because they were able to develop the various methods of manufacturing. But once they obtained success, Marx believes they turned their attention to exploiting the lower classes and being able to maintain their superior position. The middle class is the proletariat. This is the working class. So the bourgeoisie owns the means of production, and the proletariat works for the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx believed that the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie were fundamentally opposed to one another. However, he believed that the proletariat did not generally realize that. And then the lowest class in Karl Marx's social class system is the lumpen proletariat. This is the bottom of the social scale. So people like beggars or migrant workers would be put into this social class. Now, in the United States, there are 4 social classes: upper, middle, working, and lower. The upper class are the property owners. They own a large amount of property. And when discussing social classes, especially in sociological terms, property is equated with power. So the idea is that since the upper class owns a great deal of property, they have a great deal of influence and respect in society. Then there's the middle class. They own little property, but they have a good amount of income and prestige from their job. So oftentimes they'll own a little property, maybe their house and the property that that's on, and then they have a good amount of income and prestige from their job, so their occupation is looked on with respect from society. And sociologists generally divide the middle class into the upper middle class and the lower middle class. And then there is the working class. They rarely own property, and they have little income or respect from their job. So generally they're going to be renting for their life. They're not going to own property, and their job's not something or their occupation is not really respected by society. And then finally, there is the lower class. And this class never owns property, and they are frequently unemployed. And the members of these bottom 2 classes have no authority in society. And the reason being is that they rarely or never own property. And remember, property is equated with power. And they also have little income or extremely little income because they're unemployed. Because of that, they can't exert much influence with their wealth. And they don't have much respect in society because their job doesn't give them any type of respect. So the working and lower classes have very little authority in society. So that's a look at social classes. Gender is the set of traits that a society assigns to males and females, specifically those that are not biological. And this is because in sociology, a discussion of gender goes well beyond biological differences. These traits can be a person's way of speaking, appearance, movements, or anything else to which masculinity or femininity is assigned. Gender roles are the distinct task and behavior patterns that it defines as being appropriate to either men or women. And it refers to the society of which we are speaking. So this is when there are stereotypes about how certain genders are supposed to act, or what responsibilities are to be assigned to them. So, for example, in some cultures, gender roles would say that the male is the one who goes and works and provides for the family, and the female stays at home. That would be an example of a gender role. Then there's gender stereotypes. This is any superficial but strongly held beliefs about the characteristics of males and females. This is slightly similar to gender roles, but gender roles is more about responsibility, and gender stereotypes is more about overall character qualities. And then there's gender stratification of a society. This is the unequal assignation of rewards based on gender. So gender stratification is seen all throughout society. It occurs in the home and in the workforce, among other places. A term called glass ceiling is often used to refer to gender stratification within the workplace. And so this refers to the limit placed by society on women's upward mobility in the workplace. So the idea of the glass ceiling is that there is a limit on how much a woman can achieve in her career. So this goes with what promotions they get and what pay they receive. So if a woman says, I applied for this promotion but I didn't get it, the glass ceiling is holding me down. That's saying that she believes that her male colleague, her male coworker, was chosen over her simply because he is a male, and because of that, he's also going to be getting paid more than her. And then there's the term second shift, and this is another prominent gender term. And this is the idea that women's household duties account for an unpaid 40-hour work week. And the term second shift suggests that the woman takes on these motherly roles even if both parents work. So even if the male and female, if the husband and wife in a relationship both work 40-hour work weeks, the idea is that at the home, the woman is still expected to take care of many of the household duties, resulting in a 40-hour work week at home that she's not paid for. If the woman doesn't work, the second shift still kind of goes into effect, but really this is referring to when the husband and wife both work and she comes home and she has to do a second shift of labor to take care of household duties. So overall, this means that the woman is having to work 80 hours a week. So this is a look at gender. Culture is the comprehensive style of living that is developed in a society and maintained from generation to generation. So culture is basically everything that is learned by a member of a particular society, though it may include things that an individual learns but which become assumed and are never made explicit either in the individual's mind or in their social interactions. So basically culture includes things that are just assumed, that you don't even realize are part of culture because no one actually ever taught them to you, you just picked up on it. So because of that, many sociologists feel that it's difficult to properly study one's own culture. And so sociologists suggest that only the unclouded eye of a foreign observer can perceive a society's most fundamental values. So what makes up culture? This can be composed of traditions, rituals, language, social norms, technology, and economic structures. Now, culture can be split into two main categories, material culture and non-material culture. So material culture is the physical objects that the people of that society have either created or to which they assign cultural meaning. So that is material culture. It has to do with objects. So material culture may include objects like books, jewelry, buildings, and furniture, or certain pieces of land that are attached to special meaning. Then there's non-material culture. This is society's customs, beliefs, political structures, languages, and ways of using material objects. So non-material culture are the values and norms as opposed to the physical things that are used to express those values and norms. So material culture is more tangible and non-material culture is intangible. And typically, non-material culture is more difficult to change than material culture, though its change may be more difficult to see. So that's a look at culture.